My grandfather sold his legacy ranch for $3 million and gave every single penny to my father in exchange for lifelong care. But on a freezing Tuesday night in Denver, my father shoved him into a rideshare with nothing but a trash bag and dumped him on my porch like yesterday's garbage. I took him in. A few months later, he passed away. At the reading of his will, the lawyer revealed my grandfather's final wishes, and the entire room fell dead silent. Even I was absolutely stunned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that greed always catches up with those who put money over family. I am Abigail. I am 33 years old, working as a financial auditor, and living in a modest townhome in Denver. I spend my days analyzing spreadsheets, tracking assets, and making sense of chaotic numbers. I like order. I like things to make sense. But absolutely nothing made sense at 11 o'clock on a freezing sleet-filled Tuesday night. The winter storm had been raging since the afternoon, the kind of bitter Colorado cold that seeps through the window panes and freezes the world solid. I was already in my pajamas reviewing a client file on my laptop when the doorbell rang. It was not a polite knock. It was a desperate, continuous ringing followed by a weak thud against the wood. I hurried to the front entryway, checking the peephole. I could barely see anything through the driving sleet, just a dark, hunched shape leaning against the frame. I unbolted the door and pulled it open, bracing myself against the biting wind. And, standing there on my welcome mat, was my 82-year-old grandfather, Henry. I was wearing a thin, unlined nylon windbreaker. No hat, no gloves. His frail frame was violently shaking, his teeth chattering so hard I could hear the sound over the howling wind. In his trembling bare hands he gripped a single black plastic trash bag. I looked past him just in time to see the red tail lights of a ride-share vehicle disappearing down my street, swallowed by the snow and darkness. "Grandpa," I gasped, grabbing his icy arms and pulling him across the threshold. I slammed the door shut against the storm, cutting off the freezing wind, but the cold radiating from his body was terrifying. "Abigail," he whispered, his voice weak and ragged. His lips were literally blue. "I am sorry. I did not know where else to go. Thomas told the driver to bring me here. My father. Thomas had done this." I did not waste time asking questions. The forensic auditor in me snapped into emergency mode. I dropped his plastic trash bag onto the floor and immediately started peeling off his soaked, freezing windbreaker. His hands were like ice blocks. I guided him to the living room couch, sitting him down before sprinting to the hall closet. I pulled out my heaviest fleece blankets, a heated electric throw, and thick woolen socks. I wrapped the blankets tightly around his shaking shoulders, plugging in the electric throw and cranking the setting up to maximum. I ran to the thermostat and pushed the heat up to 80 degrees. Then I rushed to the kitchen, filling the kettle and turning on the stove with shaking hands. My mind was racing, trying to process the sheer cruelty of what was happening. My grandfather had a heart condition. He was frail. He had given my parents everything he owned just 6 months ago to secure a safe, warm place to live out his final years. And now he was sitting in my living room, freezing to death. I brought a mug of steaming chamomile tea to the couch, pressing it into his trembling hands. "Wrap your fingers around the mug, Grandpa. Just absorb the heat. Do not try to drink it yet." He nodded slowly, his eyes watered and unfocused. The violent shivering was beginning to subside into a deep, bone-rattling tremor. I knelt on the floor in front of him, pulling off his damp loafers and rubbing his icy bare feet to get the circulation going before slipping the woolen socks over them. He looked so small. The proud, strong cattle rancher who had taught me how to ride a horse and balance a ledger was reduced to a fragile old man seeking refuge in the middle of the night. It broke my heart, but more than that, it ignited a profound, blazing anger in my chest. I looked over at the black trash bag sitting pitifully on my entryway floor. That was all he had. I stood up and walked over to it, opening the cheap plastic knot. Inside there were 3 pairs of bundled socks, a worn flannel shirt, a toothbrush, and his orange plastic pill organizer containing his daily heart medication. That was it. $3 million given to his son, and this was his return on investment. A trash bag and a one-way ride into a winter storm. I am so sorry to be a burden, Abigail. He rasped, his voice catching in his throat. I know you work early. I know you are busy. You are never a burden, I told him fiercely, returning to the couch and sitting beside him. I pulled the heated blanket tighter around his neck. You are my grandfather. This is your home for as long as you want it to be. He closed his eyes and a single tear escaped, tracking down his weathered cheek. The heat from the mug was finally returning some color to his pale hands. I watched his chest rise and fall, listening to the slight wheeze in his breathing. The cold had settled deep into his lungs. What happened tonight, Grandpa? I asked gently, keeping my voice steady to mask the absolute fury boiling inside me. Why did Thomas send you out in this weather? He took a slow, trembling sip of the tea, swallowing hard. Susan was hosting a dinner party, a big one, caterers a string quartet. It was to celebrate Madison and Andre. They just closed some big real estate deal. The music was so loud, Abigail. It was shaking the floorboards in my room. I just went downstairs to ask them to turn the bass down so I could sleep. He paused, coughing a dry, painful cough that made him hunch forward. I rubbed his back, waiting. Thomas was furious that I interrupted his toast. Grandpa continued, his voice barely a whisper now. He pulled me into the hallway. He told me I was embarrassing him in front of Andre's wealthy friends. He said I was a senile freeloader ruining their mood. Before I knew what was happening, he grabbed a bag from the kitchen, threw my pills and a shirt inside, and told me to get out. He ordered a car and told the driver your address. He said I was your problem now. I sat perfectly still, digesting the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. A senile freeloader, the man who had handed them $3 million in liquid cash to fund their luxurious lifestyle, was now a freeloader. My father Thomas and my mother Susan had hosted a lavish party for my sister and her husband, completely funded by the very man they had just kicked out into the freezing rain. Let me check your pulse, I said softly, changing the subject to keep him calm. I placed 2 fingers on his wrist. His heart rate was elevated, erratic. He was 82 years old, thrust into sub-freezing temperatures with no coat. The physical shock to his system was severe. The financial auditor in me was trained to look at risks and liabilities, and right now the immediate liability was his health. I need to call an ambulance, I said, reaching for my phone. You are wheezing, Grandpa. Your chest sounds congested. No hospitals. He pleaded, his hand weakly grasping my wrist. Please, Abigail, just let me rest here. I am just cold. I will be fine once I warm up. I looked into his tired, frightened eyes and realized he was terrified of being institutionalized, terrified of losing whatever shred of dignity he had left after tonight. I compromised. We stay here tonight, but I am taking your temperature every hour. If you spike a fever or your breathing gets worse, we are going straight to the emergency room. He nodded gratefully, leaning his head back against the cushions. I spent the next hour sitting on this floor by the couch, adjusting his blankets and making sure he finished the hot tea. Gradually, the violent shivering stopped, replaced by the heavy, exhausted sleep of a man who had been pushed to his absolute physical and emotional limits. Once I was certain he was sleeping deeply, I stood up and walked into my kitchen. I picked up my cell phone from the counter. The clock read midnight. I did not care. I found my father's contact and pressed call. It rang 3 times before going straight to voicemail. He was actively declining my calls. I dialed again. Declined. I dialed a 3rd time. Declined. A moment later, a text message popped up on my screen. It was from Thomas. Your grandfather is a nuisance and embarrassing us in front of Andre's clients. You deal with him. We have earned our peace. Do not call this number again tonight. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. The sheer arrogance. The utter lack of humanity. They had earned their peace. They had bought their peace with his money, and then discarded him the moment he became an inconvenience to their high society image. I walked back into the living room and looked at my grandfather. He was sleeping, but his breathing was shallow and rattled with congestion. The blue tint had left his lips, but his skin remained dangerously pale. He had trusted them. He had handed over his entire life's work, the legacy of a ranch he had built with his own 2 hands, believing his son would honor a simple promise to care for him. I am a forensic auditor. I spend my life uncovering hidden assets, exposing fraud, and holding embezzlers accountable. My parents thought they could steal $3 million, dump the human evidence on my doorstep, and continue clinking champagne glasses with my sister and her husband. I turned off my phone screen and slipped the device into my pocket. I looked at the cheap plastic trash bag sitting on my floor containing the total net worth they had allowed him to keep. "You want me to deal with him, Thomas?" I whispered to the empty room. "Fine, I will deal with him, but I am going to deal with you too." I pulled a thick notebook from my work bag on the dining table and sat down in the armchair opposite the couch. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the dim light listening to my grandfather struggle to breathe, and I began to map out exactly how I was going to dismantle my parents' lives piece by piece. Every dollar they had taken, every asset they had hidden, every lie they had told. They had chosen the wrong daughter to mess with. They had chosen the wrong old man to throw away. And by the time I was finished with them, they would be the ones shivering in the cold with absolutely nothing left. The sound of the sleet battering against the living room window grew louder, matching the steady, unrelenting rhythm of my racing pulse. I opened my notebook, grabbed my pen, and began the work. I was going to audit my own family, and the penalty for their fraud was going to be absolute ruin. My grandfather sold his legacy cattle ranch for $3 million and handed every last penny to my father in exchange for a simple promise of lifelong care. But on a night when the sleet was freezing to the pavement, my father dragged him out of his room, shoved him into a stranger's car with nothing but a trash bag, and dumped him on my porch like garbage. I took him in and fought to keep him alive. Months later, at the reading of his will, the lawyer revealed my grandfather's final wishes. My family sat there vibrating with greed, expecting to inherit whatever was left. Instead, the truth was exposed, and the entire room fell dead silent. Even I was absolutely stunned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that greed always catches up with those who put money over family. My name is Abigail. I am 33 years old, working as a financial auditor in Denver. My entire professional life is built on tracing numbers, finding hidden truths, and maintaining strict order. But no amount of logic could prepare me for what happened at 11 o'clock on a freezing Tuesday night when I opened my front door to find my 82-year-old grandfather Henry standing on my welcome mat. He was shivering violently in a thin windbreaker, clutching a black plastic trash bag, having just been abandoned by a rideshare driver in the middle of a brutal winter storm. The physical shock of his icy skin against my hands sent a surge of pure panic through my chest. I pulled him inside immediately, slamming the door against the freezing wind. I stripped off his soaked jacket, guided him to the living room couch, and piled every heavy fleece blanket I owned over his trembling frame. I ran to the kitchen, my hands shaking as I boiled water for tea, desperate to raise his dangerously low core temperature. When I brought the steaming mug to his lips, his hands were trembling so badly he could barely hold the ceramic. I sat beside him, wrapping my own hands over his to steady the cup. He looked up at me, his eyes watering, and the story of how he ended up discarded like trash spilled out between his chattering teeth. 6 months ago, my grandfather had made a decision that sealed his fate. He sold his legacy cattle ranch in Wyoming, the massive stretch of land he had worked with his bare hands for 5 decades, for a total of $3 million. My Thomas and Susan had spent weeks aggressively wearing him down. They preyed on his advancing age and his desire for family connection, convincing him to sign the entire sum over to them under a verbal care contract. They promised him the luxury in-law suite in their sprawling gated mansion, swearing he would receive round-the-clock care, dignity, and absolute comfort for the rest of his days. He trusted his only son. He handed over his life savings to buy peace in his final years. But tonight that illusion shattered completely. Through ragged breaths, my grandfather explained the incident that led to his exile. My parents were hosting a massive catered dinner party. It was a lavish celebration for my younger sister Madison and her husband Andre, designed purely to show off their supposed wealth in front of Andre's high-rolling day trading clients. The bass from the surround sound system in the dining room was vibrating the floorboards of my grandfather's suite. The noise was deafening, the laughter and clinking glasses echoing through the mansion. He simply put on his slippers, walked downstairs, and quietly asked my mother if they could lower the volume just a little bit so he could sleep. He never made it back up the stairs. My father, desperate to maintain his facade of flawless wealth and perfect control in front of the investors, completely snapped. He cornered my grandfather in the hallway, his face red with unhinged rage. In front of catering staff and passing guests, my father called his own dad a senile freeloader who was ruining the mood and embarrassing the family. My father did not just yell, he marched into the in-law suite, grabbed a plastic trash bag from the kitchen, and callously threw in 2 pairs of socks, a flannel shirt, and my grandfather's essential heart medication. He physically marched an 82-year-old man out the front door, shoved him into a rideshare vehicle, and punched in my address. A sickening fury boiled in my veins as I listened to him struggle to breathe. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table and dialed my father's number. It rang twice before he declined it. I called again. Declined. Seconds later, a text message lit up my screen. Your grandfather is a nuisance and embarrassing us in front of Andre's clients. You deal with him. We have earned our peace. I stared at the glowing text, the sheer entitlement and cruelty, making me physically sick to my stomach. They had stolen his $3 million to pay for their mansion, their designer clothes, and their extravagant parties, and now they claimed they had earned their peace by leaving him to freeze to death in a winter storm. A harsh, wet cough suddenly snapped my attention back to the couch. My grandfather slumped forward, gasping for air, a terrifying rattling sound deep in his chest, signaling something far worse than a simple chill. The severe exposure to the freezing sleet had rapidly settled into his lungs. I dropped my phone and immediately dialed emergency services, my voice tight with fear as I requested an ambulance to my address. As I knelt on the floor holding his blue-tinted hands, waiting for the paramedics to arrive, my financial auditor instincts merged with a deep primal rage. I looked at the pathetic plastic trash bag sitting on my rug, containing the total net worth they had allowed him to keep. I made a silent, unbreakable vow right there in the living room. My father told me to deal with him. I would. But I was also going to deal with my parents, my sister, and her arrogant husband. I was going to follow the money, and I would not stop until they paid for every single tear my grandfather was shedding tonight. I barely had my pen pressed to the paper when a sudden wet gasping sound tore through the quiet living room. I dropped my notebook and lunged toward the couch. My grandfather was clutching his chest, his body bucking upward as a violent, choking cough seized him. His eyes were wide and shut tight with panic, and a sickening, rattling noise echoed from deep within his lungs, with every desperate attempt he made to pull in air. The color I had just managed to coax back into his cheeks vanished, replaced instantly by a horrifying ashen gray. His lips turned a deep bruised purple. He was suffocating. The extreme cold exposure had triggered a rapid fluid buildup in his lungs. I grabbed my phone from my pocket and dialed 911, my fingers slipping on the screen. The operator answered, and I shouted my address, demanding an ambulance immediately. I explained that an 82-year-old man with a heart condition was in acute respiratory distress after severe cold exposure. The next 10 minutes were a blur of absolute terror. I held his head elevated, wiping the cold sweat from his brow, while he wheezed, his grip on my forearm terrifyingly weak. The flashing red and white lights of the ambulance finally cut through the sleet outside my window. 2 paramedics rushed through my front door, bringing a blast of freezing wind with them. They took one look at his blue lips and immediately strapped an oxygen mask over his face, lifting his frail body onto the stretcher. I grabbed my coat and his plastic bag of medication, locking the door behind me as I ran out into the storm to follow the ambulance to Denver General Hospital. The emergency room was a chaotic maze of harsh fluorescent lights and screaming monitors, but my entire focus was narrowed on the small cubicle where a team of doctors surrounded my grandfather. They worked frantically to stabilize him, pushing intravenous antibiotics and fluids into his veins to combat the severe hypothermia and the acute pneumonia that had taken over his weakened system. I stood outside the glass doors, shivering in my damp coat, watching the man who had built a massive legacy reduced to a helpless patient fighting for a single breath. The anger that had been simmering inside me erupted into a full-blown inferno. I pulled my phone out and dialed my father's number again. I did not care that it was the middle of the night. I did not care about his lavish dinner party or his wealthy son-in-law. He needed to know that his actions had nearly killed his own father. The line rang twice before he declined the call. A moment later, my screen lit up with a text message. It was from Thomas. The message read that my grandfather was a nuisance and embarrassing them in front of Andre's clients. He told me to deal with him because they had earned their peace. He ordered me not to call the number again tonight. I stared at the glowing words, burning them into my memory. They had earned their peace. My parents had convinced an 82-year-old man to sell his beloved cattle ranch, the land he had bled for his entire life, for $3 million. They had taken every single penny of that money, promising him a safe and comfortable home until his final days. But the moment his existence became slightly inconvenient to their high society image, the moment he simply asked them to turn down their party music so he could sleep, they threw him into the freezing sleet and declared they had earned their peace. A doctor stepped out of the cubicle holding a clipboard with emergency room admission papers. His expression was grim. He explained that my grandfather's core temperature had dropped to a critical level, causing severe strain on his heart and lungs. They were admitting him to the intensive care unit immediately. I signed the paperwork, my hands steady, despite the rage coursing through my veins. I walked into the cubicle and stood beside the hospital bed. My grandfather was unconscious, an oxygen mask strapped to his face, monitors beeping steadily around him. I reached out and gently took his hand. His fingers were still bruised and blue from the cold. I squeezed his hand and made a silent, unbreakable vow. My parents had treated him like garbage to protect their wealth. I was going to use my skills to strip them of every asset, every dollar, and every shred of dignity they possessed. The hospital required me to go home and gather some basic supplies for his extended stay. But as dawn broke, casting a pale gray light over the snow-covered streets of Denver, I did not go back to my townhome. I drove my modest sedan straight toward the exclusive gated community where my parents lived. My grip on the steering wheel was so tight my knuckles ached. On the passenger seat beside me rested a thick manila folder containing the emergency room admission papers and the preliminary medical bills, which were already climbing into the thousands. The security gates of their opulent neighborhood loomed ahead. My parents were so arrogant and so careless that they had never bothered to update their guest access codes. I punched in the old keypad code, and the heavy wrought iron gates swung open smoothly. I drove up the winding, pristine driveway and parked directly behind my brother-in-law Andres' brand-new luxury sport utility vehicle. The corporate logo on the license plate frame caught my eye. My forensic auditing instincts flared instantly. The vehicle was registered to a commercial entity, not a personal owner. A tiny detail, but an important one. I marched up to the massive double front doors. I did not knock. I did not ring the bell. I used the spare key my mother had given me years ago for emergencies. I pushed the heavy doors open and walked right into the grand foyer. The air smelled of expensive espresso and catered food. Laughter echoed from the formal dining room. I walked straight toward the sound, my boots leaving wet footprints on their imported marble floors. I stepped into the dining room, and the scene before me made my blood boil. It was a catered post-party brunch. My father Thomas, my mother Susan, my younger sister Madison, and her husband Andre were sitting around a massive mahogany table. Andre, a charismatic day trader who wore his custom-tailored suits like armor, was holding up a crystal flute filled with a mimosa. They were laughing, celebrating their successful evening, and toasting to a brand new investment. The sheer contrast between their glittering, extravagant morning and the sterile, beeping intensive care unit where my grandfather lay fighting for his life was nauseating. They froze as I walked in. I did not say a word of greeting. I marched straight to the table and slammed the thick manila folder of hospital admission papers down, right next to my mother's champagne glass. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the dining room. I demanded they pay his medical bills out of the $3 million they took from him. My mother scoffed, visibly annoyed that I had ruined their celebratory toast. She took a slow sip of her champagne and told me not to be dramatic, Abigail. She said we do not have liquid cash for his hypochondria. Andre smirked, adjusting the heavy gold Rolex on his wrist. He leaned back in his chair and told me that Thomas and Susan had invested that money into a new venture. He claimed the funds were tied up, and that Henry was old and did not need millions anyway. He proudly stated that he and Madison were building a legacy here. Madison instantly chimed in, her voice dripping with condescension. She called me a jealouser who was just trying to ruin their prosperity because I chose a boring career. My father did not even look me in the eye. He simply raised his hand and signaled for his private security guard to escort me out of the house. He coldly stated that the $3 million was a gift and that he legally owed my grandfather absolutely nothing. As the security guard grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the table, Andre mockingly reached into his pocket. He pulled out a crisp $100 bill and tossed it onto the marble floor at my feet, telling me to buy the old man some cough syrup on them. I left the money lying on the floor, but as I was dragged out, my eyes locked onto the corporate logo on Andre's new luxury vehicle parked in the driveway. My financial auditing instincts kicked into absolute overdrive. They had not just invested that money, they had hidden it. My fingers flew across the keyboard the moment I got back to my townhome. I bypassed sleep entirely. The coffee I brewed was black, bitter, and strictly functional. I had taken an immediate unpaid leave of absence from my auditing firm. My boss had been understanding when I mentioned a family medical emergency, but he had no idea that my time off was about to be consumed by the most intense personal forensic investigation of my career. For the next 3 days, my life was divided into two distinct halves. By day, I sat by my grandfather's bed in the intensive care unit, holding his frail hand and listening to the agonizing mechanical rhythm of the ventilator keeping him alive. By night, I sat at my dining room table surrounded by empty coffee mugs, diving deep into the murky digital underbelly of my family's finances. I started with the obvious thread: Apex Holdings, LLC. It took me less than 2 hours to pull the public corporate registry filings from the state database. Andre thought he was clever by registering the LLC in Delaware, a state known for corporate anonymity, but he was sloppy with the registered agent details. He had used a cheap online legal service to form the company, and the digital footprint led straight back to a commercial office park in downtown Denver. An office park where Andre rented a small executive suite. But Apex Holdings was just the outermost layer of the onion. As I traced the property records and vehicle registrations linked to that specific LLC, a massive, arrogant spending spree emerged. Andre had not invested my grandfather's $3 million into high-yield assets for future growth. He had used the shell company to go on an immediate, untraceable shopping binge to project an image of extreme wealth to his day trading clients. I found the title for the matte black SUV, purchased in cash. I found records for 2 other luxury vehicles, a sports car for him, and a high-end convertible for Madison, both leased under the corporate entity to write off the expenses. I found the deed to a massive multi-million-dollar waterfront estate in a highly exclusive neighborhood, purchased entirely through a secondary shell company that was completely managed by Andre. Madison's new dream home was entirely funded by my grandfather's stolen ranch money. The sheer scale of their greed was breathtaking. They were bleeding the $3 million dry on depreciating luxury assets, treating my grandfather's life savings like a limitless slush fund. But the most damning discovery came on the 4th night of my investigation, and it had nothing to do with Andre. While mapping out the initial transfer of the $3 million from my grandfather's account to my father, I noticed a massive discrepancy. Thomas had not transferred the entire sum to Andre's LLC. Nearly $800,000 had been instantly diverted the moment the check cleared. I began pulling property tax records, federal lion registries, and historic business filings tied directly to my parents' names. What I found made my blood run completely cold. My parents, the ones who paraded around their gated community, projecting an image of flawless upper-crust success, were drowning in debt. For the past decade, my father had been quietly concealing a mountain of unpaid federal taxes. His previous business ventures had failed spectacularly, and instead of paying his obligations, he had hidden the losses, falsified his returns, and ignored the escalating penalties. The IRS had been quietly circling them, preparing to place federal tax liens on their mansion and freeze their remaining assets. They did not take my grandfather in out of the goodness of their hearts. They took him in because they were desperate. They aggressively convinced him to sell his ranch because they needed his cash to pay off the federal government and avoid absolute financial ruin. They used an 82-year-old man as a human shield against the IRS. I sat back in my chair staring at the glowing monitor, a profound disgust washing over me. They had stolen his money to pay off their secret tax evasion, handed the rest to Andre to launder into luxury real estate, and then kicked the old man out into a blizzard the moment the check cleared and he became a nuisance. The next morning, the hospital called. The antibiotics had finally knocked back the worst of the pneumonia, and they had successfully taken my grandfather off the ventilator. He was weak, his breathing was shallow, and his heart had suffered permanent damage from the extreme stress, but he was awake and lucid. I packed my laptop and the thick binder of printed financial documents into my bag and drove straight to the hospital. When I walked into his room, he looked even smaller than before, swallowed up by the stark white hospital bed. I pulled a chair close to his side and took his hand. He offered a fragile, tired smile. "Abigail," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "You look exhausted." "I am fine, Grandpa," I assured him softly. "But we need to talk. I need to show you something." I opened the binder and placed it on the tray table across his lap. I did not sugarcoat the truth. He was a proud man, a rancher who respected honesty above all else. I walked him through the documents, explaining the shell companies, the luxury vehicles, Madison's waterfront estate, and finally, my parents' massive hidden tax debt. I watched his eyes scan the highlighted numbers. I watched the realization settle over him. He did not cry. The initial heartbreak of being thrown out of the house had burned away, replaced by something much harder. I watched the frail, sick old man transform back into the tough, uncompromising patriarch who had built an empire from the dirt. He realized his son did not just disrespect him. His son had conned him. He looked up from the papers, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with a cold, clear fury. "Call Donovan." Donovan, my grandfather, commanded, his voice suddenly steady and carrying the weight of absolute authority. Donovan was my grandfather's longtime estate lawyer, a ruthless bulldog attorney based back in Wyoming, who had handled the sale of the ranch. He was famously aggressive, known for destroying anyone who attempted to cross his clients. I made the call. Donovan flew into Denver the very next morning, marching into the hospital room with a briefcase and an expression of pure thunder. Right there in the sterile environment of the intensive care unit, my grandfather executed a brilliant ironclad legal maneuver. We did not just draft a new will. Donovan went straight for the throat. Using the massive stack of forensic evidence I had compiled, he quietly and rapidly filed a civil suit against my parents, Madison and Andre, for elder financial exploitation. In our state, the laws protecting the elderly from financial abuse are severe. Donovan immediately secured a court order, slapping a silent, devastating legal lien on every single asset purchased with the stolen $3 million. Andre's shell companies, Madison's waterfront home, my parents' bank accounts. All of it was locked down, frozen tight by the court. They could not sell, transfer, or access a single dime, and they had absolutely no idea the trap had been sprung. A week later, the damage to my grandfather's heart finally proved too much. The doctors moved him to comfort care. I sat by his side for 2 days, holding his hand, playing soft country music, and telling him stories about my childhood on the ranch. He passed away peacefully on a quiet Thursday morning, his hand slipping gently from mine. I was devastated. The tears I had held back for 2 weeks finally broke, and I wept quietly by his bedside, mourning the only true family I had ever known. Less than 3 hours after he took his last breath, while I was still at the hospital, signing the release paperwork, my cell phone rang. The caller ID showed my mother's name. I wiped my face, cleared my throat, and answered, expecting perhaps foolishly a moment of maternal comfort. "Abigail," my mother's voice was sharp and aggressive, entirely devoid of any grief or sympathy. "I need you to go into Henry's belongings. He has a vintage gold Rolex, Thomas gave it to him years ago. Get it and bring it to the house today. Andre needs to wear it for his anniversary photo shoot tomorrow morning, and it goes perfectly with his new suit. I stood in the hospital corridor, listening to the sterile hum of the medical equipment around me. My grandfather was not even cold yet, and they were already picking over his corpse for jewelry. I will let you know when the funeral arrangements are finalized, Susan. I said, my voice dead flat, and I hung up the phone. They wanted to play games. They wanted to treat my grandfather's life like a clearance sale. Fine. The trap was set. The evidence was filed, and I was going to let them walk right into their own destruction. I stood in the center of their imported marble dining room, my wet boots sinking into their expensive rug. The juxtaposition of their glittering champagne-soaked luxury against the image of my grandfather, fighting for his life on a sterile hospital bed, drove the tension in my chest to a breaking point. I slammed the thick manila folder of Grandpa's emergency room admission papers right down on their brunch table, rattling the crystal glasses. My grandfather had developed severe pneumonia overnight, and the medical bills were already staggering. I looked dead into my father's eyes and demanded they pay his medical bills out of the $3 million they took from him. My mother, Susan, scoffed. She looked visibly annoyed that I had ruined their celebratory toast. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne and waved her manicured hand at me. Don't be dramatic, Abigail. We don't have liquid cash for his hypochondria. Andre, my sister's charismatic day trader husband, smirked. He leaned back in his chair, casually adjusting his heavy diamond-encrusted gold Rolex. Look, Abigail, Thomas and Susan invested that money into our new venture. It is tied up. Henry is old, he doesn't need millions. Madison and I are building a legacy here. Madison immediately chimed in, crossing her arms. She called me a jealous spinster, claiming I was just bitter because I chose a boring career counting other people's money. My father did not even flinch. He signaled for his private security guard to escort me out. As the guard grabbed my arm, Andre mockingly tossed a crisp $100 bill onto the floor, telling me to buy the old man some cough syrup. I yanked my arm free from the guard's grip. I didn't scream. I bent down, picked up the $100 bill, and looked at each of them. I walked out of the massive double doors, the sound of their resumed laughter burning in my ears. But as I marched down the pristine driveway, my eyes locked onto the corporate logo on Andre's new luxury sports car. It read, Crestview Capital LLC. My financial auditing instincts kicked into absolute overdrive. They had not just invested that money, they had hidden it. I drove straight back to Denver General Hospital. The winter storm had intensified, turning the roads into sheets of black ice, but my mind was completely focused on the hunt. When I reached the intensive care unit, Dr. Evans pulled me aside. Grandpa Henry's condition was deteriorating. The pneumonia was aggressive, and his lungs were filling with fluid. He needed an experimental respiratory treatment, one that was not covered by basic Medicare. The out-of-pocket cost was $40,000. I sat down in the uncomfortable plastic chair next to his bed. The rhythmic mechanical hiss of his oxygen machine filled the silence. I opened my laptop on the narrow hospital tray table. I am a forensic auditor. I hunt financial ghosts for a living, and it was time to tear my family's legacy to the ground. I logged into the state's corporate registry database and ran a trace on Crestview Capital LLC. It took me less than 2 hours to unravel their entire scheme. The limited liability company had been registered precisely 3 days after my grandfather signed over the sale of his ranch. The registered agent was Andre, but the primary shareholders were my mother, my father, and Madison. They had used the shell company to go on an untraceable shopping binge, shielding the assets from personal liability and, more importantly, from taxes. I traced the property deeds and wire transfers. They had purchased a $2 million commercial building in downtown Denver entirely under the LLC. The remaining million had been funneled into high-risk offshore day trading accounts controlled completely by Andre. They were literally gambling my grandfather's lifeblood on the stock market. Seeing my mother's signature on the incorporation documents brought a bitter, agonizing memory crashing back. This was not the first time Susan and Thomas had committed financial treason. It was a systematic pattern of abuse. When I was 18, I received an acceptance letter to my absolute dream university, along with a partial academic scholarship. I still needed $10,000 to cover the remaining tuition. I had worked grueling shifts at a local diner for 3 years, saving every single dime in a joint custodial account my father controlled. On the day I went to the bank to request the cashier's check for my tuition, the teller informed me the account was empty. My father had drained my entire life savings to pay for Madison's extravagant Sweet 16 party and to put a down payment on her first luxury car. When I confronted them devastated and sobbing, my mother had scoffed, using the exact same tone she used this morning at brunch. She told me not to be dramatic, insisting that Madison needed to keep up appearances for her social circle. She told me to just take out a student loan because they were building a family image. I was forced to decline my dream school and attend a local community college while working 2 jobs. They had stolen my future to fund their vanity, and now they were stealing my grandfather's life for the exact same reason. The heavy wooden doors of the intensive care unit suddenly swung open, snapping me out of my memories. It was not a nurse or a doctor. It was my father, Thomas, flanked by a man in a sharp gray suit. It was Richard Vance, our ruthless family attorney. They had not come to check on Henry's health. My father looked at the tubes connecting his own dad to the life-saving machines and actually sneered in disgust. "What are you doing here, Thomas?" I demanded, standing up and physically blocking his path to the bed. "We are here to clean up your mess, Abigail," my father said coldly, adjusting his silk tie. "You have no legal right to make medical decisions for him. Richard has drafted the necessary paperwork to transfer his medical power of attorney to me, his next of kin. We are moving him to a state-run facility. The hospital bills you are racking up are completely unnecessary." A cold wave of horror washed over me. He wanted to pull the plug. He wanted to move my grandfather to a miserable, underfunded facility to die quietly, so the $3 million would remain permanently in their pockets. If Henry died, there would be no one left to contest the verbal care contract. "He is suffering from severe pneumonia because you threw him into a blizzard," I said, my voice trembling with contained absolute rage. "You are not touching him." Richard Vance stepped forward, holding out a sleek silver pen and a clipboard. "Abigail, let us be pragmatic. Henry is 82. His quality of life is diminishing rapidly. Your father has the legal right to assume control over his care. If you interfere, we will have you removed from the premises for trespassing. Furthermore, your little stunt at the brunch this morning was borderline harassment. Thomas and Susan are prepared to file a restraining order against you if you do not comply." My father looked at the monitor displaying Henry's erratic, struggling heartbeat. "Sign the transfer, Abigail. We are taking custody of him tonight. He is a drain on our resources, and I will not allow your emotional instability to bankrupt this family." I looked at the clipboard, then at the attorney, and finally at my father's smug, entitled face. I did not scream. I did not cry. I reached into my leather work bag and slowly pulled out a single heavily stamped sheet of paper. "You are too late, Thomas," I said, handing the thick document directly to the lawyer. "When Grandpa arrived at my house last night before he lost consciousness, and before the pneumonia took over, he was terrified you would do exactly this. He signed a comprehensive, legally binding medical and financial power of attorney granting me absolute, irrevocable control over his health care and his remaining estate. It was digitally notarized by my neighbor, who happens to be a licensed state notary." Richard Vance quickly scanned the document, his professional facade dropping instantly. He leaned in and whispered to my father, "The document is ironclad, Thomas. She has full authority. We cannot touch him." My father's face contorted with a vicious, ugly fury. "You manipulative little—" "Get out!" I commanded, stepping forward and pointing toward the sliding glass doors. "You have zero authority here. And Thomas, I highly suggest you check the corporate compliance laws regarding Crestview Capital LLC. Using stolen, untaxed funds to purchase commercial real estate and funneling the rest into offshore accounts is a very dangerous game. It would be an absolute shame if the IRS caught wind of your new legacy." My father froze perfectly still. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking as ashen as the man lying in the hospital bed. How did I know about Crestview? I let the heavy silence hang in the air, letting the sheer terror of exposure seep deep into his bones. "This is not over," Thomas hissed, turning on his heel and storming out of the intensive care unit with his lawyer trailing nervously behind him. I sat back down next to my grandfather, letting out a long, shaky breath. The battle lines were officially drawn. I had secured his immediate physical safety, but my parents were wealthy, desperate, and backed into a corner. What my father did not know was that while he was busy threatening me, I was already dismantling his life. My phone buzzed on the tray table. It was an encrypted email from an old colleague who now worked at the state tax board. The subject line read, "Urgent Crestview Capital Audit Flag." I clicked open the attachment and a slow, triumphant smile spread across my face. My parents had not just committed elder fraud. They had left a digital paper trail so incredibly damning that it was going to send their entire perfect family straight to federal prison. I clicked the encrypted attachment, my heart hammering a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs. The screen populated with rows of flagged transactions, routing numbers, and offshore corporate structures. As I stared at the irrefutable evidence of their financial crimes, the memories of that morning at the mansion played in a continuous, maddening loop in my mind. Madison's shrill voice calling me a jealous spinster who was just trying to ruin their prosperity because I chose a boring career. My father signaling his private security to physically escort me out, coldly stating the $3 million was a gift and that he legally owed Grandpa nothing. And Andre. I could still see his smug face as he mockingly tossed that crisp $100 bill at my feet, telling me to buy the old man some cough syrup on them. I had left the money on the floor, but my eyes had locked onto the corporate logo on his new luxury SUV parked in the driveway. My financial auditor instincts had kicked into absolute overdrive in that exact second. I knew they didn't just invest that money, they hid it. And now, thanks to my former colleague at the state tax board, I possessed the digital map to their entire fraudulent empire. The audit flag revealed a staggering level of arrogance and sheer financial incompetence. Andre had funneled my grandfather's stolen $3 million through Crestview Capital LLC, but he had not stopped there. Desperate to maintain his image as a hotshot investor, he had aggressively commingled my grandfather's life savings with his clients' day trading funds. I was operating a blatant, desperate Ponzi scheme to cover catastrophic losses he had suffered in the market months prior. To make matters exponentially worse, my father Thomas had systematically siphoned a large portion of those commingled funds to quietly pay off a fraction of his massive hidden IRS debt. Together they had created a tangled radioactive web of tax evasion, wire fraud, and money laundering. They were incredibly sloppy, blinded by the delusion that their wealth and gated community status made them inherently untouchable. They were wrong. I compiled the data, formatting it into a pristine 80-page forensic report, and forwarded the entire dossier directly to Donovan, my grandfather's ruthless estate lawyer. The civil suit for elder financial exploitation we had filed was already freezing their local bank accounts, but this new evidence escalated the situation entirely. This was no longer just a civil family dispute over a broken contract. It was the foundation for a multi-agency federal investigation. The trap was no longer just set, the jaws were actively snapping shut. 3 days later, my parents hosted my grandfather's memorial service. True to form, it was not a solemn gathering to mourn a beloved patriarch. It was a high society networking event, masquerading as a funeral. They had rented out the grand ballroom of the Cherry Creek Country Club, an exclusive, opulent venue completely disconnected from my grandfather's humble, hard-working roots on the ranch. A string quartet played softly in the corner, towering ice sculptures adorned the lavish buffet tables, and waiters in crisp white shirts circulated with expensive hors d'oeuvres and top-shelf liquor. I walked through the heavy double oak doors, wearing a simple black dress, carrying nothing but a slim leather portfolio. The sheer hypocrisy of the room was instantly suffocating. I stood near the back by a marble pillar observing this sickening performance. My mother Susan was holding court near a massive center floral arrangement. Dressed in a custom black designer gown that cost more than my grandfather's tractor, she dabbed her perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. She was actively gaslighting her wealthy friends, spinning a tragic, entirely fabricated narrative. I listened in disgust as she claimed Henry's mind had completely failed him, telling a group of sympathetic women that he had wandered out of their secure mansion in a state of severe dementia. She painted herself as the heartbroken, devoted daughter-in-law who had done everything humanly possible to save him from himself. Worse, a few yards away, I overheard my father holding a scotch glass, telling a group of local real estate investors a completely different, equally poisonous lie. He was claiming that I, his emotionally unstable and estranged daughter, had manipulated a confused old man in his final hours. He told them I had tried to hijack my grandfather's medical care for my own financial gain, forcing the family into an unnecessary legal battle during their time of grief. They were completely discarding the truth, rewriting reality to cast themselves as innocent victims, and me as an opportunistic villain. I did not have to wait long for the confrontation. Madison spotted me from across the room. Her eyes narrowed and she marched over her heels, clicking aggressively against the polished hardwood floor, with Andre trailing closely behind her like a tailored shadow. The entitlement radiating from them was palpable, a toxic cloud of unearned superiority. Andre reached up to adjust his cuffs, and the breath physically left my lungs. Clasped around his wrist, gleaming under the brilliant ballroom chandeliers, was a vintage gold Rolex, my grandfather's watch. The exact watch my mother had demanded I bring them mere hours after Henry had passed away in the intensive care unit. They had not even waited for a funeral. They had simply taken it from his personal belongings, while I was busy arranging his cremation, and now Andre was wearing it as a status symbol, a trophy of their theft. Madison crossed her arms, glaring at me with utter contempt. She hissed at me to leave immediately, stating in a harsh, venomous whisper that I had absolutely no right to show my face there after the legal stress I had put the family through. She reiterated her absurd delusion, telling me I was nothing but a bitter, boring spinster who was desperately trying to ruin their lives out of pure jealousy. She claimed I was trying to steal the legacy they were rightfully building because I had failed to build one of my own. Andre stepped closer, deliberately invading my personal space, attempting to use his height and his custom-tailored suit to physically intimidate me. He lowered his voice, a smug, confident smirk playing on his lips. He told me that the temporary legal freeze I had managed to put on their accounts was nothing more than a minor irritating annoyance. He confidently stated that Richard Vance, their high-powered defense attorney, was already drafting a motion to have the injunction completely lifted by Monday morning. He leaned in and whispered that I was entirely out of my league, playing a dangerous game with people who had resources, connections, and power I could not even comprehend. He told me to drop the lawsuit, go back to my tiny cubicle, and leave the real money to the professionals before I got crushed. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I looked at the gold Rolex on his wrist, then up into his arrogant, mocking eyes. I let a cold, clinical smile touch my lips. I asked Andre, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion, exactly how his offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands were performing this quarter. I asked him if his wealthy day trading clients, the ones currently sipping champagne in this very room, knew that their investment capital was currently floating Crestview Capital's massive unreported market losses. I asked him how he planned to explain to the IRS that he had commingled stolen elder funds with unverified, untaxed investment capital to maintain his luxurious lifestyle. The color instantly drained from Andre's face. The cocky, untouchable day trader vanished in a fraction of a second, replaced by a man staring directly down the barrel of a loaded gun. His jaw went slack, his eyes widened in sheer panic, and the smug smirk evaporated completely. Madison looked between us, her brow furrowed in deep confusion. She did not understand the specific financial terminology, but she perfectly recognized the sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from her husband's rigid posture. I informed them both that the state tax board was not nearly as forgiving as a civil court judge, and that federal wire fraud carried a mandatory minimum prison sentence. I told Andre that keeping the vintage Rolex was about to be the absolute least of his problems. Before Andre could formulate a response, before he could even take a breath to defend himself, the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swung open with a resounding, thunderous crash. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing their bows, freezing mid-note on the strings. The low murmurs and polite laughter of the country club elite died down to a dead, absolute silence. Donovan, my grandfather's imposing, broad-shouldered estate lawyer, strode into the center of the room. He was not dressed for a funeral, he was dressed for war. He carried a thick leather-bound legal document securely under his arm. He stopped in the middle of the ballroom, his piercing gaze sweeping over the shocked pale faces of my parents, my sister and her terrified husband. He cleared his throat, his deep commanding voice echoing across the silent breathless room. He announced that per the final legally binding and irrevocable instructions of Henry's estate, the reading of the will and the execution of the final assets would take place immediately publicly and in the presence of all gathered guests. My parents, standing frozen by the expensive floral arrangements, realized simultaneously that the peace they thought they had earned was about to become their absolute, undeniable ruin. The encrypted email from my former colleague at the state tax board glowed brightly on my laptop screen, illuminating the dark, quiet corners of my townhome. The subject line read, "Urgent Crestview Capital Audit Flag." I opened the attached file and a slow, triumphant smile spread across my face. The doctors at Denver General had been incredibly blunt with me. The extreme cold exposure and the resulting severe pneumonia had caused irreversible damage to my grandfather's weakened heart. They stabilized him as best they could with heavy antibiotics, but hospitals are for acute recovery, not miracles. He was dying, and he desperately wanted to go home. Since my parents' mansion was a crime scene of emotional and financial abuse, my modest townhome became his final sanctuary. I took an immediate, indefinite, unpaid leave of absence from my auditing firm. I moved the furniture out of my living room and transformed the space into a palliative care suite. The steady rhythmic hiss of his oxygen concentrator became the constant soundtrack of my life. My grandfather slept for 18 hours a day, his chest rising and falling with agonizing effort beneath the thick fleece blankets I had layered over him. I spent my daylight hours administering his pain medications, adjusting his plastic mask, and holding his fragile, weathered hands. But the moment the sun dipped below the Rocky Mountains and the townhome went completely silent, my real work began. I sat at my dining room table surrounded by empty coffee mugs, yellow highlighters, and massive stacks of printed ledgers, while my grandfather fought for every single breath in the next room. I fought for absolute justice, using every forensic auditing skill I had honed over the past decade to dig a meticulously documented financial grave for my own family. My father had always openly mocked my profession. At every Thanksgiving dinner and family holiday, he would proudly parade my brother-in-law Andre around the room, boasting about his aggressive day trading and his supposed massive market wins. He would look at me, sigh with theatrical disappointment, and tell the extended family that I was just a glorified bookkeeper who lacked the vision and the alpha instinct to make real money. He claimed I was too rigid, too obsessed with the rules to ever achieve genuine elite wealth. That rigid obsession with the rules was exactly what was going to send him to federal prison. I started pulling the digital threads on Crestview Capital LLC. Andre clearly thought he was a financial genius by layering his corporate entities, but he was incredibly sloppy. He used a registered agent in Delaware to shield the primary owners of the shell company, but he funded the initial incorporation filing fees using a personal credit card tied directly to his Denver office address. From there, the illicit financial web unraveled with pathetic ease. I traced the original $3 million from the sale of my grandfather's Wyoming cattle ranch directly into a joint checking account controlled exclusively by my parents. They did not even wait a full 24 hours before funneling the cash out. $2 million vanished instantly into Crestview Capital. But the remaining $1 million took a fascinating, highly illegal detour. I dug deeply into the tax board flag my former colleague had sent me. My father had been bleeding money for years. His luxurious lifestyle, the sprawling gated mansion, the catered champagne parties, the exclusive country club memberships, was a complete and utter facade built on a staggering mountain of debt. He had evaded paying federal income taxes for nearly a decade, racking up compounding penalties that recently triggered a massive IRS lien investigation. The missing $1 million was routed through a shadow bank account to quietly pay off the federal government just days before they were set to freeze his remaining assets and seize the mansion. He had literally stolen his own sick father's life savings just to keep a designer roof over his head, and then had the sheer audacity to call my grandfather a freeloader before kicking him out into a blinding winter blizzard. I turned my attention back to Andre and the remaining $2 million. The day trader prodigy was nothing but a desperate fraud. I accessed the public trading records and shell company filings tied to Crestview. Andre had not been making brilliant, aggressive market moves. He had suffered catastrophic losses in offshore crypto accounts 6 months prior. He was drowning in margin calls. He used my grandfather's money to cover his terrible bets, effectively running a desperate Ponzi scheme to keep his wealthy clients from realizing their investments were entirely gone. The luxury SUV parked in their driveway, the custom-tailored designer suits, Madison's extravagant waterfront real estate purchases. It was all funded by stolen money layered through a corporate entity to avoid tax liabilities. My cell phone vibrated violently on the wooden table, shattering the intense quiet of the room. It was a text message from Madison. I stared at the glowing screen, my jaw clenching so hard my teeth ached. "You are making a massive mistake, Abigail," the text read. "Richard Vance is drawing up the paperwork right now to sue you for emotional distress and harassment. Andre just closed another huge deal today. We have the resources to drag you through civil court until you are completely bankrupt. Enjoy your tiny townhome and your boring little life while we build an empire. Do not ever contact us again." I read the message twice, marveling at the sheer magnitude of her golden child delusion. She was bragging about a new business deal, completely blind to the fact that her husband was a criminal who had just embezzled stolen funds to keep his sinking ship afloat. She thought their stolen wealth made them invincible. She thought my townhome was a pathetic sign of failure. But inside this tiny townhome, I held the exact sequence of wire transfers that proved Andre had committed federal wire fraud by moving stolen domestic funds into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I did not reply to her text message. Replying was what an emotional, reactionary person would do. I was an auditor. I let the hard evidence do the talking. I cross-referenced the precise dates of the offshore wire transfers with the timeline of my grandfather's ranch sale. The money moved across state lines and international borders. It was no longer just local elder abuse or civil fraud. By moving the stolen funds offshore, Andre and my father had triggered massive federal jurisdiction. They had committed money laundering, tax evasion, and wire fraud. The FBI and the IRS would not just freeze their assets. They would seize them entirely under federal forfeiture laws, leaving them with absolutely nothing. A soft, pained groan from the living room made me instantly drop my pen. I hurried over to the couch. My grandfather was awake, his weak hands trying to pull the suffocating oxygen mask away from his face. I gently guided his hand down, adjusting the plastic strap behind his ears to make him comfortable. He looked at me, his eyes exhausted, but incredibly sharp. He did not need to ask. He could see the massive stacks of highlighted paper and the glowing laptop on the dining table. He knew exactly what I was doing. He reached out, his frail fingers gripping my wrist with a surprising, desperate surge of strength. "Did you find it?" he rasped, his voice muffled by the plastic mask. "I found everything, Grandpa," I whispered, kneeling directly beside the couch so he could see my eyes. "They are completely exposed. Every single dollar they took from you. Every lie they told to hide it. I have the absolute proof." He nodded slowly, a deep, resonant satisfaction settling over his weathered, tired features. He closed his eyes and let out a long, heavy breath that rattled in his chest. "Burn it down, Abigail," he commanded softly, his voice echoing with the authority of the man who had tamed the Wyoming wilderness. "Burn their entire world to the ground." I squeezed his hand, the promise sealing itself permanently in my heart. I walked back to the dining table and compiled the final master document. I had the bank routing numbers, the offshore account IDs, the forged tax documents, and the precise timeline of the theft. The civil suit our lawyer Donovan had filed earlier was a brilliant distraction, keeping my parents completely occupied with local court injunctions while I prepared the ultimate killing blow. I opened a secure server portal and addressed an encrypted data package to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and the regional director of the Internal Revenue Service. But right before my finger hovered over the send button, a loud, violent pounding echoed from my front door. The heavy thuds physically shook the doorframe, followed by my father's muffled, furious voice demanding I open up immediately. He had just discovered the local civil asset freeze, and the illusion of his perfect, peaceful life had just violently shattered. I walked out of the hospital into the biting Denver cold, leaving the sterile scent of the ward behind me. My grandfather was gone, but the machinery of my revenge was already operating flawlessly. I drove back to my townhome, opened my laptop, and watched the digital traps I had meticulously constructed snap shut one by one. Donovan had worked with lightning speed. The civil lien was a masterpiece of legal maneuvering, but my forensic audit was the heavy ammunition that made it lethal. I had mapped out every single fraudulent wire transfer, creating a comprehensive digital paper trail that was impossible to refute. My father had not just taken the $3 million from the sale of the ranch, he had orchestrated a sophisticated laundering operation. He had funneled the cash directly into a shell LLC managed entirely by Andre. Andre had then weaponized those funds, treating my grandfather's life savings like a limitless personal slush fund. He used the stolen money to purchase a massive waterfront estate for Madison, along with multiple depreciating luxury assets, exotic sports cars, and designer wardrobes. It was all a hollow, desperate attempt to project a sickeningly wealthy lifestyle to his day trading clients. He was building a fake empire on the back of an 82-year-old man. But the most putrid layer of their deception, the true secret weapon in my arsenal, was my parents' hidden mountain of IRS tax debt. They had been actively concealing a decade of severe tax evasion from everyone projecting upper crust success, while secretly drowning in federal penalties. They had stolen a massive chunk of Henry's money simply to pay off the federal government and save their own skins. They had sacrificed my grandfather's life to avoid total financial ruin and federal prison. Now my audit had exposed their entire structure to the authorities. The next morning arrived, the day of Madison and Andre's highly publicized anniversary photo shoot. I sat at my kitchen island sipping black coffee, monitoring the restricted access alerts on the family accounts through a read-only portal Donovan had secured. At precisely 9 in the morning, the first domino fell. Andre attempted to pay the luxury photographer a $5,000 retainer using the primary corporate card linked to the Shell LLC. The transaction was instantly declined. I watched the digital logs light up as blind panic clearly set in on their end. They tried a secondary credit card. Declined. Madison tried to wire funds from their joint checking account. Blocked by court order. The massive waterfront estate was hit with a public notice of lis pendens, freezing any possibility of a quick sale or taking out a line of credit against the property. Their limitless wealth had evaporated into thin air in a matter of seconds. By noon, my father realized the full catastrophic scope of the disaster. He logged into his accounts to finalize the illicit payment to the IRS, desperate to clear his hidden tax debt before the federal agents seized his mansion. Access denied. The screen flashed a notification that his accounts were frozen, pending an active investigation for elder financial exploitation. My phone began to vibrate violently across the table. First came a call from Madison, then Andre, then my mother, and finally my father. I let every single call go straight to voicemail. I listened to their messages, transitioned from arrogant demands to frantic confusion, and finally to absolute unadulterated terror. They realized they were completely locked out of their own lives. I arranged a quiet, dignified funeral for my grandfather. There were no country club ballroom, no towering ice sculptures, and no high society networking. We held it at a small rustic chapel on the outskirts of the city, a place that honored the hard-working, honest rancher he had always been. I stood by the simple wooden casket, greeting the few genuine friends Henry had made over his lifetime. 20 minutes before the service began, the heavy chapel doors swung open. My parents, Madison and Andre, marched down the aisle. They looked entirely different from the arrogant aristocrats who had sipped champagne at brunch just a few weeks prior. Madison was pale, her designer makeup unable to hide the deep dark circles under her eyes. Andre looked physically ill, his custom suit hanging loosely on his rigid frame. My father was practically vibrating with rage, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked ready to shatter. They cornered me near the altar, away from the other guests. Susan demanded to know what I had done, her voice a sharp, trembling hiss. She accused me of destroying the family, claiming their credit cards were useless and their bank accounts were locked tight. Madison glared at me, her hands shaking as she demanded I call my lawyer and reverse the freeze immediately. I looked at them feeling absolutely nothing but cold, clinical satisfaction. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the precise factual tone of an auditor presenting a final devastating report. I told them I had simply followed the digital paper trail. I explained in agonizing detail exactly how I had mapped the transfer of the $3 million into Andre's Shell LLC. I watched Andre's face crumble as I listed the exact purchase dates of the waterfront estate and the luxury vehicles, proving I knew every single asset they had bought with stolen money. Then I turned my attention directly to my father. I watched his eyes widen in sheer horror as I casually mentioned his hidden mountain of IRS tax debt. I told him that the massive chunk of funds he had tried to use to pay off a decade of tax evasion was now permanently frozen by the court. I stepped closer, ensuring they heard every single word. I informed them that my forensic audit had not just been given to Donovan for the civil suit. The entire dossier, complete with irrefutable evidence of wire fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering, had been formally submitted to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and the Internal Revenue Service. They had wanted to treat my grandfather like a disposable asset. They had stolen his legacy to project a fake wealthy lifestyle and cover up their own criminal negligence. Now the federal government was fully aware of their deception. The waterfront estate, the sports cars, the suburban mansion, the offshore accounts, it was all going to be seized. They were not just bankrupt, they were facing federal prison. My father opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The arrogant patriarch was entirely broken, crushed under the weight of his own monumental greed. I turned my back on their stunned, ashen faces and walked toward the pulpit to deliver my grandfather's eulogy, leaving them to stand in the absolute ruins of their own making. The violent pounding on my front door rattled the deadbolt, sending a shockwave through the quiet town home. "Abigail, open this door right now." My father's voice roared from the porch, muffled by the heavy wood, but dripping with feral panic. He rattled the handle aggressively. He hadn't discovered the federal filings yet. My finger was still hovering over the send button on my laptop, but someone had clearly tipped him off that I was pulling public records on Crestview Capital. I quietly closed my laptop screen, plunging the dining room into darkness. I did not run to the door. I did not shout back. Instead, I walked deliberately to the wall-mounted security panel and armed the alarm. The sharp mechanical chirp echoed in the entryway. "I am calling the police, Thomas," I stated, my voice dead calm and loud enough to pierce the thick oak door. "You have 30 seconds to get off my property before they arrive." The rattling instantly stopped. A heavy, suffocated silence fell over the porch, followed by the rapid, frantic crunch of his expensive dress shoes retreating through the snow. He was running. He was terrified, but he had absolutely no idea just how deep the grave I had dug for him actually was. I turned my back to the door and walked into the living room, which I had stripped of furniture to accommodate the palliative care hospital bed. The rhythmic hissing hum of the oxygen concentrator was the only sound left in the house. My grandfather was awake. The commotion had stirred him from his medication-induced sleep, but there was no fear in his pale, weathered eyes. There was only a cold, hardened clarity. I pulled a wooden chair close to the edge of his bed and sat down. I placed the thick, heavily highlighted binder of financial documents directly onto the blanket across his lap. "Was that my son?" Grandpa Henry rasped, pulling the plastic oxygen mask down slightly to speak, his breathing shallow but steady. "Yes," I replied softly, placing my hand over his frail, trembling fingers. "He knows I'm looking into the money, but we need to talk, Grandpa. I need to show you exactly what I found. It is worse than we thought." I did not sugarcoat the truth. He was an 82-year-old rancher who had spent his entire life valuing brutal honesty over comforting lies. I opened the binder and began walking him through the dense, tangled financial web I had unraveled over the past 3 sleepless nights. I showed him the incorporation documents for Crestview Capital LLC, established just 3 days after he signed over the $3 million check from the sale of his Wyoming ranch. I showed him the property deeds. I explained how his son and his day trader son-in-law, Andre, had used the shell company to immediately purchase a multi-million-dollar waterfront estate for Madison. I pointed to the vehicle registrations, the luxury sports cars, and the matte black SUV, all bought in cash under the corporate entity to project a fake aggressive image of high society wealth. I watched my grandfather's eyes scan the highlighted numbers. I watched the initial shock wash over him, but I kept going, delivering the final, most devastating blow. "They didn't just buy houses and cars, Grandpa," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "Thomas and Susan were completely broke. They have been hiding a massive mountain of unpaid federal taxes for a decade. The IRS was about to seize their mansion. They used nearly $1 million of your ranch money to secretly pay off the federal government." He stared at the bank routing numbers proving the transfer to the Treasury. The silence in the room was absolute save for the mechanical hiss of the oxygen machine. I watched the realization settle deep into his bones. His son had not just disrespected him. His son had not just lost his temper and thrown him out into a blizzard because he was an inconvenient burden. His son had conned him. They had orchestrated the sale of his life's work, stolen the cash to save themselves from federal prison, laundered the rest into vanity assets, and then discarded him the absolute second the check cleared. The profound, devastating heartbreak of a father betrayed by his own child burned away in an instant. The frail, sick old man lying in the hospital bed vanished. As he looked up from the papers, his jaw tightened, the muscles ticking in his cheek. His eyes, usually warm and tired, were suddenly burning with a cold, uncompromising fury. He was once again the ruthless, iron-willed patriarch who had built an empire out of dirt and grit. "Call Donovan," my grandfather commanded. His voice did not shake. It carried the immense heavy weight of absolute authority. Donovan was my grandfather's longtime estate lawyer, based back in Wyoming. He was a notorious bulldog attorney, a man fiercely loyal to Henry, and famously ruthless against anyone who dared cross his clients. I made the call. I told Donovan everything. Less than 12 hours later, Donovan walked through the front door of my townhome. He had caught the first flight out of Cheyenne. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He marched into the makeshift hospital room, clutching a thick leather briefcase, taking one look at Henry's condition before his face contorted into a mask of pure professional wrath. Right there, beside the hum of the medical equipment, we turned my living room into a legal war room. Donovan reviewed my forensic audit, his eyes widening at the sheer sloppy arrogance of my parents' financial laundering. "We are not just drafting a new will," Donovan growled, pacing the hardwood floor. "A new will only dictates what happens to the assets after you pass Henry. By then these parasites will have drained the accounts dry, fighting Abigail in probate. We are cutting off their oxygen right now." Donovan opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents, slapping them onto the tray table. It was a brilliant, ironclad, and devastatingly aggressive legal maneuver. Using the mountain of forensic evidence I had compiled, Donovan was filing an immediate emergency civil suit against Thomas, Susan Madison, and Andre for elder financial exploitation and fraud. In our state, the laws protecting vulnerable seniors from financial abuse by family members are aggressively strict. But Donovan wasn't just filing a lawsuit to drag them into a courtroom. "I am filing this under seal with an emergency ex parte motion," Donovan explained, a shark-like grin spreading across his face. "The judge will grant a silent legal lien on every single asset purchased with your $3 million, Crestview Capital, the waterfront estate, the sports cars, their personal bank accounts. We are putting a hard, uncompromising freeze on everything." My grandfather gripped the silver pen Donovan handed him. "Will they know?" he asked, his voice rough. "Not until it's too late," Donovan replied. "They won't receive a polite summons in the mail. They will only find out the trap has snapped shut when their credit cards start declining, when their bank accounts show a zero available balance, and when they realize they can't sell or mortgage a single piece of that property. They will be entirely locked out of their own stolen lives." My grandfather did not hesitate. With a steady, determined hand, he signed his name across the bottom of the affidavits, officially authorizing the strike. He signed the new will, disinheriting my father entirely, and executed the irrevocable power of attorney granting me absolute control over his remaining affairs. I watched the ink dry on the paper, a cold thrill of anticipation racing down my spine. My parents thought they were untouchable. They thought their gated community and designer clothes shielded them from the consequences of their spectacular greed. They had treated my grandfather like a disposable bank account, completely underestimating the loyalty of his lawyer and the absolute terrifying precision of an auditor pushed to the brink. Donovan packed the signed documents back into his briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a sharp final click. The legal bear trap was officially armed, completely silent, and buried right where my family was about to step. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind Donovan, leaving my townhome wrapped in a profound, heavy silence. The legal bear trap was officially set, buried deep beneath the digital snow, waiting for my family to take their next arrogant step. But inside my living room, the war was paused. For the next 7 days, the relentless forensic auditor ceased to exist. I was simply a granddaughter keeping a quiet vigil at the edge of a fading world. I moved a comfortable armchair right next to my grandfather's hospital bed, abandoning my dining room table and the stacks of highlighted ledgers. With the burden of his stolen legacy lifted from his shoulders, Henry's remaining energy was spent purely on finding peace. We spent hours talking about Wyoming. He described the sharp, clean scent of the pine trees after a sudden summer thunderstorm, the exact reddish-brown shade of the dirt on his ranch, and the way my grandmother used to laugh when the horses got loose. I recorded his voice on my phone, capturing the rich, gravelly timbre of his stories, so I would never forget the sound of the man who had truly raised me. Not once during that entire week did my phone ring with a call from my parents. Madison never texted. Andre never inquired. They lived less than 20 miles away in their stolen waterfront estate, yet they could not be bothered to spare a single second for the man whose bank account had funded their entire reality. Their absolute silence was a daily, visceral reminder of exactly why Donovan's legal filings were entirely justified. The end came on a Tuesday night. The relentless Colorado winter wind had finally died down, leaving the air outside still and freezing. Inside, the rhythmic mechanical hiss of the oxygen concentrator seemed to slow, matching the increasingly shallow rise and fall of my grandfather's chest. I knew the signs. The hospice nurses had prepared me for this exact transition. I pulled my chair closer, sliding my hand over his. His skin was paper thin and cool to the touch, but his grip still held a faint echo of the strong, capable rancher he had always been. He opened his eyes one last time. The exhaustion and pain that had clouded his vision for months were suddenly gone, replaced by a striking, luminous clarity. He looked at me, his gaze transferring a lifetime of love, trust, and absolute conviction. He squeezed my fingers slightly, a final silent command to stay strong and finish what we had started. Then he simply closed his eyes. His chest rose, fell, and settled into permanent stillness. The oxygen machine continued its steady hum, but the room was utterly empty. My grandfather was gone. The devastation was absolute. The physical weight of the grief crashed into me, stealing the breath from my lungs. I sat beside him for hours in the dim light, holding his lifeless hand, before finally summoning the strength to make the necessary calls. The respectful, quiet removal of his body by the hospice team in the early hours of the morning left the house feeling impossibly large and incredibly hollow. I stripped the hospital sheets from the bed, moving like a machine running on empty. By 8 o'clock the next morning, I was sitting at my kitchen island, staring blankly at the wall. I clutched a mug of coffee that had gone ice cold hours ago. I felt hollowed out, entirely consumed by the loss of the only person in my family who had ever truly loved me. I was completely alone. My cell phone vibrated violently against the granite countertop, shattering the quiet morning. The caller ID flashed brightly, Susan. I stared at the glowing screen. A tiny, naive fraction of my brain wondered if somehow she had felt it. I wondered if some dormant, buried maternal or familial instinct had alerted her that the patriarch of our family had passed into the next life. I cleared my throat, swallowing the heavy lump of grief that threatened to choke me, and swiped to answer the call. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice raw and broken from hours of crying. Abigail, finally. I have been trying to reach you all morning. My mother's voice barked through the speaker. There was no warmth. There was no hesitation. There was no gentle inquiry about my well-being or her father-in-law's condition. It was the brisk, irritated tone of a wealthy woman who had been inconvenienced by a subordinate. Mom. I started taking a trembling breath, preparing to deliver the heavy news of Henry's death. Listen, Madison and Andre have their luxury anniversary photo shoot at the estate tomorrow. She interrupted, talking right over my grief with staggering speed. The photographer is flying in from Los Angeles and charging $5,000 a day. Andre's outfit is missing a crucial accessory to tie the whole look together. We need Henry's vintage gold Rolex, the one with the presidential bracelet. Andre wants to wear it for the close-up shots to project that generational wealth aesthetic for his social media following. Bring it to the mansion by noon. I sat frozen on my kitchen stool. My brain struggled to process the sheer monstrous audacity of her words. My grandfather's body had been gone from my house for less than 4 hours. The sheets on his deathbed were currently tumbling in my washing machine, and my mother was calling to aggressively demand his most prized sentimental possession to use as a prop for her criminal son-in-law's vanity project. Mom, I said, my voice dropping an octave, the sorrow instantly vaporizing into white-hot rage. Grandpa Henry passed away early this morning. There was a pause on the line. I waited for the gasp. I waited for the sudden sharp intake of breath. I waited for the realization of permanent loss to hit her. The silence lasted for exactly 3 seconds. Oh, Susan exhaled. It was a sharp, brief sound that conveyed absolutely nothing but mild surprise. Well, I suppose it is a blessing, really. He was suffering and he was becoming incredibly difficult to manage. The timing is actually somewhat convenient given the extensive estate planning your father and I need to finalize this week. She did not ask if he was in pain at the end. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not ask a single question about funeral arrangements or what to do with his remains. Anyway, she continued, seamlessly pivoting back to her original train of thought without skipping a single emotional beat. Since he has passed, he obviously doesn't need the watch anymore. Do not make me send Andre all the way to your tiny townhome to get it, Abigail. You know how tight our schedule is today with the caterers arriving. Bring the Rolex to the mansion by noon. We are having brunch before the styling team gets here. She hung up. The line went dead with a sharp click. I lowered the phone slowly to the granite counter. The crushing grief that had been drowning me just minutes ago was entirely gone. It had been incinerated, replaced by a cold, calculating, and highly lethal clarity. My grandfather was right. They were not family. They were parasites. They wanted to parade around in his jewelry while his body was barely cold. They wanted to project the illusion of generational wealth using the stolen assets of a man they had emotionally and financially slaughtered. I looked across the living room at the heavy oak bookshelf where I had safely stored the vintage gold Rolex. It sat in its original faded green velvet box, a beautiful piece of horological history that Henry had worn every single day of his working life until he became too frail to lift his arm. I stood up from the kitchen island, my posture straightening as the last remnants of the heartbroken granddaughter faded away. I was the legally appointed executor of Henry's estate, and I was the architect of their total destruction. I would absolutely go to the mansion. I would gladly hand-deliver the vintage gold Rolex. But I was also bringing the federal freeze notices, the civil lien documentation, and the absolute devastating end of their entire fraudulent world. The drive to my parents' sprawling suburban estate took exactly 22 minutes. It was 22 minutes of gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, processing the staggering reality of what I was about to walk into. In the passenger seat sat my grandfather's faded green velvet watchbox. Right beneath it rested a thick, unmarked manila envelope containing the absolute destruction of my family's fraudulent empire. Donovan had moved with lethal efficiency. The ex parte motion was signed. The silent legal liens were already attaching themselves to every property, bank account, and corporate entity tied to Crestview Capital. I parked behind a line of commercial catering vans and florist trucks blocking the circular driveway. The heavy mahogany front doors were propped wide open. I stepped into the grand foyer and was immediately hit by the chaotic energy of a high society gala in the making. Men in crisp white shirts were carrying massive silver chafing dishes toward the formal dining room. A team of florists was aggressively arranging towering displays of white lilies and hydrangeas around the sweeping curved staircase. My mother stood in the center of the madness barking orders at a terrified-looking event planner while aggressively tapping her manicured finger against a gold-plated clipboard. She wore a tailored black silk dress that looked more suited for a cocktail party than a day of mourning. When she finally noticed me standing in the entryway, her expression tightened with immediate irritation rather than grief. "Abigail, finally," Susan snapped, marching toward me with her hand outstretched. "Tell me you brought the watch. The photographer is already setting up in the solarium, and Andre is having a meltdown about his accessories." I did not offer a hug. I did not shed a tear. I simply handed her the velvet box. "Grandpa Henry is dead, Mom. He passed away just a few hours ago." Susan took the box, popping it open to inspect the gleaming gold Rolex inside. She did not even look at me. "Yes, you mentioned that on the phone. It is a tragedy, of course. But honestly, Abigail, the timing could not be more complicated. We have 75 of Andre's top-tier investors flying in this weekend. We had to pivot our entire strategy." My father, Thomas, descended the grand staircase, buttoning a custom-tailored charcoal suit. He held a glossy brochure in one hand and his cell phone in the other. He glanced at me, offering a brief, completely hollow nod. "Abigail, good you are here. We need to go over the logistics for the week," Thomas said, his voice carrying the brisk, commanding tone of a CEO conducting a quarterly review. He slapped the brochure onto the marble entryway table. I looked down at it. It was a catalog from a discount high-volume mortuary located 2 towns over. "I have already handled the arrangements for your grandfather," Thomas announced proudly, adjusting his silk tie. "I secured a basic direct cremation package and a standard pine casket for the brief viewing. State law requires a container, and this was the most cost-effective option. It ran about $800. The man was a simple rancher, Abigail. He would absolutely hate it if we wasted good money on a mahogany box that is just going to be burned anyway." I stared at him, my stomach twisting with a violent, acidic disgust. "You bought your own father the cheapest pine box allowed by state law," I stated, my voice dangerously flat. "It is about being practical," my mother interjected, rolling her eyes as if my grief was a tedious inconvenience. "Because we have to reallocate the real budget toward the celebration of life reception this Saturday. We are hosting it at the Oak Ridge Country Club. It is going to cost roughly $60,000, but it is an absolute necessity." I gripped the manila envelope tighter. $60,000 for a reception, but $800 for his casket. "You lack vision, Abigail. You always have." Thomas sighed, looking at me with profound disappointment. "Andre's offshore accounts took a massive hit last quarter. His investors are getting spooked. They are asking questions about liquidity and stability. We need to project absolute, unshakable wealth. A lavish high society memorial service is the perfect cover. We bring all the investors together, we pour premium champagne, we serve caviar, and we show them that the family is strong, united, and incredibly well-funded. We are turning a tragedy into a networking opportunity. It is brilliant." Right on cue, Andre and Madison strolled into the foyer. Madison looked immaculate, her hair professionally blown out, wearing a designer morning dress that probably cost more than my grandfather's entire funeral package. Andre practically snatched the velvet box from my mother's hands. He pulled out the vintage gold Rolex, a heavy, beautiful timepiece earned through decades of backbreaking labor on a Wyoming ranch, and strapped it onto his wrist. He held his arm up, admiring the gold against his tailored cuff. "Perfect." Andre grinned, completely ignoring the fact that the man who owned it had just taken his last breath. "This gives me that old money generational wealth credibility. Investors love a guy who inherits the family legacy. It makes them trust the portfolio." I stood in the center of the sprawling multi-million-dollar mansion, surrounded by flowers and catering staff, and looked at the 4 of them. They were utterly devoid of humanity. They had stolen my grandfather's $3 million life savings. They had used it to buy this absurd house, these designer clothes, and the very catering they were currently organizing. They had left him to die in my stripped-down living room, and now they were using his death as a marketing event to cover up their failing Ponzi scheme. My thumb traced the edge of the manila envelope. I had come here to drop the bomb. I had come here to hand them the federal freeze notices and watch their world burn to ash, right in this foyer. But as I listened to them gleefully plan their $60,000 sham funeral, a new, far more devastating strategy crystallized in my mind. Dropping the hammer in private was too good for them. They wanted an audience. They wanted to parade their fake wealth and their fake grief in front of 75 elite investors. They wanted a stage. I decided right then and there to let them have it. I would let them spend the money. I would let them put on their high society show. I would let them gather every single person they wanted to impress into one opulent country club ballroom. Because the federal freeze Donovan had initiated was a silent lien. It was currently working its way through the banking system, attaching to every routing number and corporate account like a lethal virus. By Saturday, the financial lockdown would be absolute. You are right, Dad, I said, forcing my face into a mask of quiet, defeated submission. I lack vision. You all clearly have this under control. I will leave you to your planning. Madison scoffed, flipping her hair over her shoulder. Try to wear something decent on Saturday, Abigail. Andre's clients will be taking photos. We don't need you looking like a depressed bookkeeper. I did not respond. I turned on my heel and walked out of the mansion, leaving them to their champagne and their floral arrangements. The next 4 days were a masterclass in psychological torture and absolute restraint. While my parents finalized their country club menus and selected ice sculptures, I sat alone in the sterile, fluorescent-lit basement of the discount mortuary. I sat beside the rough, splintering pine box my father had purchased. I held my own private vigil for the man who had taught me everything about integrity. I promised him that justice was coming. My phone constantly buzzed with updates from Susan. She complained about the cost of the imported orchids. She complained that the country club required a 50% deposit up front, which Andre had confidently paid using the Crestview Capital corporate account. Every time she sent a text bragging about their lavish expenditures, I checked the secure legal portal Donovan had provided. The silent liens were locking into place. The trap was fully armed. Saturday arrived with a bitter, biting chill. The Oak Ridge Country Club was a fortress of exclusivity, a sprawling estate of manicured greens and towering stone pillars. I pulled my modest car into a parking lot filled with Bentley's Range Rovers and heavily tinted black town cars. Andre's investors had arrived in full force. I walked through the double doors of the grand ballroom, clutching the manila envelope tightly against my side. The room was breathtakingly excessive. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over dozens of tables draped in black silk. Waiters in white gloves circulated with silver trays of champagne flutes and delicate hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet played softly in the corner. It looked exactly like the elite high society event my parents had craved, and right in the center of the room, standing beside a blown-up, professionally retouched photograph of my grandfather, stood my family. Andre was shaking hands, laughing smoothly, the gold Rolex flashing under the chandeliers. Thomas was clapping men on the shoulder, projecting the image of a strong, wealthy patriarch. Susan and Madison were performing their roles flawlessly, dabbing at fake tears, while subtly dropping hints about the family's robust investment portfolio. They were putting on the performance of a lifetime. They had absolutely no idea the curtain was about to drop. The Oak Ridge Country Club ballroom was a masterclass in grotesque, unapologetic opulence. My parents had seamlessly transformed what should have been a solemn memorial service into an elite, high-stakes networking gala. Waiters in pressed white tuxedos and black silk bow ties navigated the sea of tailored charcoal suits and designer morning gowns, balancing heavy silver trays piled high with beluga caviar, prime rib crostinis, and flutes of imported vintage champagne. A professional string quartet played in the far corner of the room, their gentle, melancholic melodies completely drowned out by the sharp, booming laughter of Andre's wealthy day-trading clients. I stood near the perimeter of the room, clutching a glass of sparkling water, watching my family actively monetize my grandfather's death. My father Thomas was holding court near a towering, intricately carved ice sculpture of an eagle taking flight. He was swirling a glass of premium bourbon, effortlessly transitioning from somber performative head nods to aggressive rapid-fire business pitches with local real estate developers. It was sickening to witness. They had buried Henry in an $800 pine box just 2 hours prior, rushing through the graveside service as if it were a minor irritating inconvenience. The pastor had barely finished the final prayer before my mother was aggressively checking her watch and signaling the valet. Now surrounded by crystal chandeliers and tens of thousands of dollars in imported white floral arrangements, they were finally in their element. I needed to get away from the crowd. The sheer suffocating hypocrisy of the room was making my skin crawl. I navigated through the throngs of investors and socialites, keeping my head down, making my way toward the lavish buffet spanning the entire back wall of the grand ballroom. I just wanted to grab a small plate retreat to a quiet, unobserved corner and wait for the precise moment the digital guillotine dropped on their entire operation. But before I could even reach for a silver pair of serving tongs, I felt a sharp, deliberate tap on my right shoulder. I turned to find Madison and Andre blocking my path. They stood shoulder to shoulder, presenting a unified, impenetrable front of designer grief. Madison looked me up and down, her eyes narrowing as they dragged over my simple, off-the-rack black dress. She wore a custom couture morning gown that clung to her perfectly, the dark fabric shimmering under the ballroom lights. Her neck and wrists were draped in heavy, glittering diamonds that were undoubtedly purchased with the stolen proceeds of my grandfather's cattle ranch. She leaned in close, her heavy, suffocatingly expensive perfume assaulting my senses. "I see you could not be bothered to dress for the occasion, Abigail," Madison whispered, her voice a razor-sharp hiss, masked by a perfectly polite, photogenic smile. "You look like you are attending a mid-level corporate tax seminar, not a country club reception. It is actually embarrassing to look at you. Andre has highly visible, high-profile clients here today, and you are standing around looking like a member of the catering staff. Could you not afford a single decent piece of fabric?" I kept my expression entirely neutral, channeling the cold, emotionless detachment I use during hostile corporate audits. "I am dressed for a funeral, Madison, because my grandfather just died. I did not realize I needed to wear runway couture to grieve a man you just buried in a cheap pine box." Madison let out a soft, highly patronizing laugh, shaking her head. "Always so dramatic and always so incredibly bitter. That bitterness is exactly why you have absolutely nothing in this world. If you had just been a better, more compliant daughter, maybe mom and dad would have included you in their financial planning. Instead, you constantly rebel, you constantly judge our lifestyle, and now look at you. You are completely isolated." She tilted her head, her eyes shining with malicious, unadulterated satisfaction. "Mom told me you actually took an indefinite unpaid leave from your auditing firm just to wipe his face and change his sheets. You torpedoed your own career for an old man who had absolutely nothing left to give you, and now you are going to be drowning in his leftover medical bills and hospice care debt. It is pathetic, Abigail. If you had just played by the family rules, Andre could have brought you into his portfolio. We could have helped you build a real life. But you chose to be the stubborn outcast, and now you have to live with the consequences of your own financial stupidity." I did not correct her. I did not tell her that my grandfather had excellent health insurance and zero medical debt. I did not tell her that the only people drowning in catastrophic financial consequences were standing directly in front of me. I just stared at her, letting the silence stretch, absorbing every single ounce of her profound, delusional arrogance. Andre, clearly bored with mocking my wardrobe and eager to secure his next mark, turned his attention away from me. A group of men in sharp, tailored suits was approaching the buffet. These were his whales, the elite investors he had been desperately trying to keep on the hook while his offshore crypto bets quietly imploded. His entire demeanor shifted instantly. The cruel, sneering brother-in-law vanished immediately, replaced by the slick, grieving, yet remarkably resilient financial prodigy. "Gentlemen," Andre said, stepping forward and extending his hand. As he reached out, the heavy vintage gold Rolex slipped out from under his tailored cuff, catching the brilliant light of the overhead chandeliers. "Thank you so much for coming today." Henry was a giant of a man, a true pioneer of the West. "It has been a devastatingly difficult week for the family, but seeing you all here means the absolute world to Madison and me. One of the investors, a silver-haired man holding a glass of expensive scotch, offered a sympathetic knowing nod. He sounds like a remarkable man, Andre. A real old-school self-made rancher. We were terribly sorry to hear about his passing. Are you holding up okay with the firm? We know how grief can impact daily operations. We are pushing forward, Andre replied smoothly, placing a comforting proprietary hand on Madison's waist. Henry would have wanted it that way. He was a man who understood aggressive growth and the importance of securing a dynasty. In fact, we are looking at a massive, unprecedented expansion of Crestview Capital in the coming weeks. Henry was very old school, very quiet and secretive about his wealth. Andre leaned in closer to the investors, dropping his voice into a conspiratorial, highly exclusive register designed to make them feel like insiders. Between us, the Wyoming ranch was just a fraction of his portfolio. The man had vast hidden land inheritances and mineral rights tucked away in blind trusts that are just now being triggered by his passing. We are talking tens of millions in untouched generational wealth that is about to flood directly into Crestview Capital. We are going to have a massive injection of liquid capital by the end of the month. I am telling you guys right now, the upcoming quarter is going to be explosive. We are scaling up the waterfront properties and moving heavily into commercial acquisitions across the state. I stood completely frozen beside the carving station, listening to Andre brazenly lie to federal financial witnesses. He was actually using my grandfather's fresh death to sell phantom shares in a fraudulent shell company. I was promising these wealthy men a piece of an inheritance that did not exist, an empire built on a foundation of stolen money that was currently being hunted by the federal government. He was literally committing egregious securities fraud right in front of me, artificially inflating his corporate value using a dead man's ghost. It sounds like a highly lucrative opportunity, Andre. Another investor chimed in, his eyes darting down to the gold Rolex on Andre's wrist, clearly taking the watch as proof of the inherited wealth. We should sit down early next week and look at the new projections. If this land inheritance is as massive as you say, we definitely want to be positioned for the expansion before the quarter closes. Absolutely! Andre beamed, exuding the absolute confidence of an invincible conqueror. My team will send over the updated prospectus on Monday morning. The new assets are going to change the entire landscape of our firm. You will want to get in on the ground floor of this restructuring. Madison beamed proudly at her husband, playing the role of the supportive, wealthy heiress flawlessly. She turned back to shoot me one final triumphant glare. She honestly believed they had won. She firmly believed they had successfully laundered the stolen millions, buried the evidence in a cheap pine box, and secured their high society future on a throne of lies. I looked away from her smug face and glanced up at the large digital clock mounted above the mahogany bar on the far side of the ballroom. It was exactly 2:45 in the afternoon. Donovan had filed the emergency ex parte motion late Friday afternoon. The judge had reviewed the overwhelming forensic evidence and signed the silent legal liens by Friday evening. According to Donovan's strict timeline, the federal banking sweeps would execute the total asset freeze between 2 and 3 o'clock on Saturday. The banking algorithms would hit the servers, cross-reference the court orders, and instantly shut down every single account tied to my father, my mother, Madison, Andre, and Crestview Capital. There would be no warnings. There would be no grace period. I did not need to scream. I did not need to cause a scene or throw a drink in Madison's perfectly contoured face. I just needed to wait. I watched Andre clink his champagne glass with the silver-haired investor, sealing a fraudulent deal that would never see the light of day. I watched my mother urgently signal a waiter for more caviar. I watched my father laugh heartily at a joke near the ice sculpture, completely oblivious to the impending doom. They were standing at the absolute pinnacle of their fake stolen world. And the digital executioner was already swinging the axe. The low, predatory hum of financial chatter began to die down as the string quartet abruptly stopped playing. A sharp clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute echoed across the cavernous ballroom, instantly commanding the attention of every designer-clad guest. My father stood at the front of the room, adjusting the chrome microphone stand with a practiced, solemn gravity. He was positioned deliberately beneath the largest chandelier in the hall, ensuring the cascading light caught the subtle, expensive sheen of his custom charcoal suit. I retreated further into the shadows, near the heavy velvet drapes at the back of the hall, leaning against the cool mahogany paneling. I pulled my phone from my small clutch, switched the camera to video mode, and hit record. I wanted every single word documented. I wanted a high-definition, undeniable record of the exact moment my father cemented his own public destruction. Thomas gripped the edges of the acrylic podium. He bowed his head for a long, heavily calculated moment, letting the silence stretch until the entire room was holding its collective breath. When he finally looked up, his eyes were shining with perfectly manufactured tears. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice dropping into a masterful gravelly whisper that crackled through the high-end sound system. "Today, we are not just mourning the loss of a father, a grandfather, and a patriarch. We are mourning the end of an era. Henry was a giant among men. He was a man carved from the harsh Wyoming mountains, a man who built an empire out of dirt, sweat, and absolute unyielding integrity. The hypocrisy was so thick I could practically taste it in the back of my throat. He was standing in a room funded by stolen money, praising the very integrity he had mocked, exploited, and ultimately discarded. He spoke eloquently of fishing trips that had never happened. He detailed deeply personal late-night conversations by the fire that they had never shared. He wove a beautiful, completely fabricated narrative of a profound, unbreakable father-son bond that had never existed outside of his own delusional ego. "My father taught me that true wealth is not measured by the balance in your bank account," Thomas continued, his voice breaking with flawless theatrical precision. "He taught me that wealth is measured by the legacy you leave behind, by the family you protect, by the absolute loyalty you show to the people who depend on you." I stared at him through my phone screen, my finger hovering over the record button to ensure the focus remained razor sharp. I kept my breathing slow and steady, refusing to let my hand shake. But the true masterpiece of his deception was yet to come. Thomas pulled a stark white silk handkerchief from his breast pocket, wiped a single tear from his cheek, and looked out at the sea of wealthy investors with an expression of profound, weary sacrifice. "When my father's health began to fail rapidly last year, Susan and I made a solemn promise," he said, his voice trembling with heroic conviction. "We promised that he would not spend his final precious days in a cold, sterile hospital room. We brought him here. We brought him into our home. We moved heaven and earth. We spared absolutely no expense, and we transformed our estate into a sanctuary for him. We wanted his last chapter to be surrounded by the utmost luxury, by his devoted family, and by the peace he had worked his entire 82 years to earn." A quiet murmur of sympathetic approval rolled through the ballroom. I watched through the camera lens as powerful real estate developers and ruthless corporate executives wiped their eyes, completely sold on the illusion of Thomas, the devoted son. The sheer terrifying audacity of his lie was almost paralyzing. He was claiming credit for my exhausting, terrifying labor. He was boldly claiming to the world that he had nursed the man he had violently thrown out into a blinding snowstorm. He spun a beautiful, tragic tale of sitting by Henry's bedside in the waterfront mansion, holding his frail hand as he peacefully drifted away into the night. He completely erased the reality of the stripped-down townhome, the mechanical hiss of the rented oxygen machine, and the grueling, sleepless nights I spent administering crushed medication while my grandfather withered away to nothing. Thomas claimed it all for his own glorification. I panned the camera slightly to the right, capturing the rest of my family. Susan was dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue, nodding bravely as women in diamond necklaces offered her comforting pats on the shoulder. Madison leaned heavily against Andre, playing the role of the shattered granddaughter. And Andre was simply magnificent in his greed. While maintaining a perfectly mournful expression, he was making direct, sustained eye contact with his key investors across the room, subtly nodding in time with Thomas's speech, using the eulogy to silently close fraudulent financial deals. Then came the pivot. It was remarkably smooth, a seamless transition from a mourning son to a confident, aggressive corporate leader. "Henry's legacy is not just in our fond memories," Thomas announced, his posture straightening, his tone growing noticeably stronger and more resonant. He gripped the podium, projecting absolute financial supremacy. His legacy is the literal foundation of everything we are building right now. My father was a man of vast, quiet resources. He despised flashy displays of wealth, choosing instead to quietly accumulate and protect his assets. And before he passed, he entrusted me to carry that heavy torch forward. Thomas paused, locking eyes directly with the silver-haired investor Andre had been aggressively courting by the buffet line. Many of you in this room are aware that my father held thousands of acres of prime, untouched Wyoming ranch land. Land that has been in our family name for generations. Land rich with untapped mineral rights that he fiercely, stubbornly protected from developers. Thomas offered the crowd a tight, knowing smile. I am formally announcing today that the official reading of my father's will is scheduled for this coming Friday. A sharp electric current of anticipation swept through the audience. The fake mourning instantly evaporated, replaced by the sharp predatory scent of impending capital. While we deeply mourn his physical absence, I can assure everyone in this room that the transition of his remaining estate will immediately and permanently solidify our family's portfolio. Thomas declared, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable certainty. The remaining acreage, the hidden trusts, and the liquid capital will be fully integrated into our corporate structure by the end of the month. Crestview Capital is about to enter an entirely new stratosphere of explosive growth. We are honoring Henry by building an empire that will dominate this market for a century. The ballroom erupted into polite, restrained applause, but the greedy, hungry murmurs of the investors were deafening. They were hooked. They were ready to throw millions of dollars into Andre's failing offshore accounts, based purely on the promise of a massive impending inheritance. They firmly believed that Thomas was about to inherit a sprawling Wyoming kingdom. I stopped recording and slipped the phone back into my clutch. I pressed my back against the wall, my hand resting flat against the thick manila envelope hidden inside my coat. I looked up at the digital clock mounted above the mahogany bar across the room. It was exactly 2:59 in the afternoon. My parents had bought the cheapest pine box allowed by state law so they could afford this exact moment. They had discarded Henry like garbage to fund a $60,000 networking event. They were standing at the absolute pinnacle of their stolen, fraudulent reality, basking in the admiration and the impending investments of the local elite. They felt completely untouchable. The digital clock silently ticked over to 3 o'clock. Deep within the secure server farms of the federal banking system, Donovan's emergency ex parte motion executed. The algorithms received the judge's signature and the certified forensic audit. It happened instantly, and without a single warning klaxon. The silent legal liens slammed down like steel vault doors. Across the country, the routing numbers associated with Crestview Capital froze. The joint checking accounts held by Thomas and Susan plummeted to a zero available balance. The platinum credit cards tucked inside Madison's designer purse were instantly deactivated. The fraudulent shell company holding the deed to the waterfront estate was officially locked down by the state. My phone vibrated violently against my palm, a single sharp buzz that felt like a physical shockwave. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a text message from Donovan. Checkmate. Friday morning arrived with a biting, bitter chill that cut straight through the city of Cheyenne. The sky was a flat, bruised gray, threatening snow, but holding it back perfectly, mirroring the heavy, suffocating tension that had been building all week. I walked through the revolving glass doors of Donovan's downtown law office building, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor of the lobby. I wore a simple tailored black blazer and trousers. I carried no large bags, no designer purses, just a single leather folio containing a copy of my grandfather's final directives. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor was completely silent. I stepped out into Donovan's reception area, a vast, intimidating space constructed entirely of brushed steel, floor-to-ceiling glass, and dark mahogany. The receptionist, a sharply dressed woman with an earpiece, gave me a brief knowing nod and gestured toward the primary conference room down the hall. As I approached the heavy frosted glass doors, the sound of my family's voices bled through the corridor. They were practically vibrating with a toxic mixture of greed and poorly concealed desperation. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. My parents. Madison and Andre had already claimed the premium seats at the far end of the massive glass conference table. They were dressed in what could only be described as high society morning couture. Susan wore a dark structured Chanel suit with a skirt that fell exactly to the knee, her neck draped in a string of black pearls. Thomas sat rigid in a custom-tailored midnight blue suit that projected total corporate authority. Madison was draped in a black cashmere wrap over a designer sheath dress, her oversized sunglasses pushed up into her perfectly blown-out hair. And then there was Andre. He was leaning back in a plush leather executive chair, entirely disregarding the solemnity of a will reading. He was aggressively scrolling through his iPad, his finger swiping rapidly across the screen. "Look at the square footage on this Aspen compound, Maddie," Andre murmured, holding the screen up for my sister to see. 8.5 million. It has a heated driveway and a private funicular. Once your grandfather's liquid assets clear probate today, we can wire the earnest money directly from the new trust account. It is a steal. Make sure it has enough acreage for the horses," Madison replied, not even looking up from her phone. "Mom wants to stable the thoroughbreds closer to the new summer house." They were spending phantom money. They were buying estates in Aspen with cash that had already been federally frozen, locked behind an impenetrable wall of civil liens and fraud investigations. I walked quietly to the opposite end of the long glass table and took a seat. I placed my leather folio in front of me and folded my hands. For 3 full minutes they treated me as if I were entirely invisible. I was a ghost in the room, a minor irritating piece of background furniture that did not warrant their attention. The tension radiating from my father, however, betrayed the confident facade they were desperately trying to project. Thomas kept checking his phone, his jaw muscles ticking rhythmically. I knew exactly why. Over the past 6 days, the financial trap Donovan and I had set had begun to silently strangle them. Their credit cards had undoubtedly started declining at upscale restaurants. Their wire transfers to the country club caterers had bounced. Andre had likely spent the entire week sweating through his tailored shirts, blaming the catastrophic account failures on bank errors, frozen routing numbers due to Henry's death, or temporary institutional holds. They were drowning in a financial blackout, and they were banking their entire existence on this one single meeting to bail them out. They truly believed my grandfather had millions in hidden liquid cash ready to wash over them like a golden tide. "Did you take the bus here, Abigail?" Susan finally asked, her voice slicing through the quiet room. She looked down her nose at me from 20 feet away. "We offered to send one of the town cars to your townhome. It is embarrassing for the family to have you arriving at a top-tier law firm, looking like a paralegal." "I drove myself, Mom," I replied, my voice completely flat, devoid of any emotion. "We'll try to keep quiet today," Thomas ordered, slamming his phone face down on the glass table. He rubbed his temples, a thin sheen of sweat visible on his forehead. "This is a complex financial transition. Andre and I will handle the dialogue with Donovan. We need to expedite the release of the liquid capital. The banks have been incredibly incompetent this week with the corporate accounts, and we have major acquisitions closing by Monday. We do not have time for sentimental interruptions. Just sign whatever you need to sign and let the adults handle the portfolio," Andre added, not looking up from his iPad. "We have a lot of capital to move." I did not respond. I just stared at him, watching a man who was already legally bankrupt plan his next multi-million-dollar purchase. The heavy door to the conference room swung open with a sharp, definitive swoosh. Donovan walked in. He did not offer a comforting smile. He did not offer his condolences. He looked like a silver-haired shark swimming into a tank full of bleeding fish. He carried a single thick leather binder. He walked directly to the head of the table, standing right between me and my family. He dropped the binder onto the glass with a loud, echoing thud that made Madison jump. "Let us get this over with," Donovan said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that instantly commanded absolute silence. "I have another hearing at noon, and I do not like to waste my time." Thomas sat up straight, buttoning his suit jacket, preparing to play the role of the grieving heir and incoming patriarch. "Thank you, Donovan. We appreciate you expediting this. As you know, my father and I were incredibly close, and he entrusted me with the continuation of his legacy. We are ready to review the asset transfers and execute the release of the remaining funds into Crestview Capital. Donovan stared at Thomas for a long, agonizing moment. His eyes were cold dead and entirely devoid of pity. He slowly opened the leather binder, flipping past the first few pages. Thomas, Donovan stated, his tone devoid of any polite warmth. You are not the executor of this estate. Abigail is. The air in the room was instantly sucked out. Thomas's hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. Susan's head snapped toward me, her eyes widening in profound, uncomprehending shock. Andre lowered his iPad, the screen going dark. Excuse me? Thomas barked, a sharp edge of panic bleeding into his authoritative tone. That is impossible. My father named me the primary beneficiary and executor of the trust over a decade ago. Abigail is a glorified accountant. Your father, Donovan replied smoothly, reading directly from the heavily notarized document, executed a new irrevocable will and testament exactly 8 days ago. He was of sound mind, entirely lucid and fully aware of his financial landscape. I personally witnessed the signing alongside 2 attending physicians. He was dying, Susan shrieked, her hands gripping the edge of the glass table. He was medicated. This is absurd. I was furious, Donovan corrected, slamming the document flat against the table. Now sit down and listen, because the terms of this estate are non-negotiable. Donovan cleared his throat, adjusting his reading glasses. I will skip the legal preamble and get straight to the asset distribution. To my son Thomas and his wife Susan, I leave the sum of $1. This specific bequest is made to legally demonstrate that I have not forgotten you, but rather I am intentionally and permanently disinheriting you due to your catastrophic financial betrayal. What the hell is this? Andre shouted, standing up from his plush leather chair, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. This is a joke. He had millions. What about the liquid capital? What about the blind trusts? There are no blind trusts, Andre, Donovan growled, staring the day trader down. There is no liquid capital. You and Thomas saw to that when you drained his $3 million ranch sale to pay off your federal tax debt. The only asset Henry had left was the 50 acres of Wyoming ranch land that he explicitly refused to sell to your developers. Madison let out a harsh, derisive laugh. The panic was making her frantic. 50 acres. He left Abigail 50 acres of frozen dirt in the middle of nowhere. Fine. Keep the dirt, Abigail. Dad, call our lawyers. We are contesting this immediately. This is a complete waste of time. Donovan did not blink. He slowly reached into the back of his leather binder and pulled out a separate, heavily embossed folder bearing the seal of a premier global geological surveying firm. He placed it squarely in the center of the table. It is not just dirt, Madison, Donovan said, his voice dropping into a register that sent a shiver down my spine. 3 months ago, Henry authorized a deep core geological survey of those remaining 50 acres. The reports came back finalized 2 weeks before he passed. Donovan looked directly at my father, delivering the fatal blow with surgical precision. Those 50 acres sit directly on top of one of the densest, most concentrated lithium deposits ever discovered in the state of Wyoming. The survey has been independently verified by 2 mining conglomerates. The preliminary extraction valuation of that frozen dirt is roughly $15 million. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, crushing vacuum. $15 million. I watched the blood completely drain from my father's face, leaving him a ghastly, sickly shade of gray. His jaw went slack. The illusion of the powerful, wealthy patriarch completely shattered, leaving behind a terrified, broken man staring at the ghost of the father he had betrayed. Susan covered her mouth with her hands, a strangled, high-pitched noise escaping her throat as the sheer magnitude of the wealth they had just lost washed over her. Andre staggered backward, his knees hitting the edge of his chair. He gripped his hair, his eyes darting frantically around the room as his entire fraudulent reality collapsed in real time. The Aspen compound, the offshore accounts, the angry investors, it was all gone. 15 million? Thomas whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. He looked at the geological report, then looked at me. His shock rapidly, violently morphed into absolute, unrestrained fury. He slammed his fists onto the glass table with a deafening crash, the coffee cups rattling violently against their saucers. You little thief! Thomas roared, his face contorting with a terrifying primal rage. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. You orchestrated this. You kept him locked up in that pathetic little townhome, you isolated him from his real family, and you manipulated a sick, dying man into signing away my birthright. That land belongs to me. That money belongs to Crestview Capital. It is fraud! Madison screamed, jumping to her feet, her designer wrap falling to the floor. She brainwashed him. We are suing you, Abigail. We are going to drag you into court and sue you until you have absolutely nothing left. You will not see a single dime of that 15 million. Thomas bellowed, his chest heaving as he leaned over the table, spit flying from his lips. I am going to bury you in litigation. I will hire every ruthless litigator in this city. You are going to spend the next decade drowning in legal fees, and when I am done with you, I am taking that land and throwing you out on the street. I sat perfectly still in my chair at the end of the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch away from his rage. I calmly reached into my leather folio and pulled out the thick manila envelope I had brought with me. I slid it across the smooth glass surface of the table until it came to rest directly in front of my father's shaking hands. You are not going to sue anyone, Thomas. I said, my voice cold, steady, and echoing with absolute finality. Because you do not have any money left to hire a lawyer. In fact, you do not even own the suit you are currently wearing. I watched the words hit my father. He blinked, his mind completely unable to process the concept of his own sudden poverty. He looked down at his custom-tailored jacket, then back at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Before he could formulate a response, I placed my hands flat on the heavy manila envelope and pushed it slowly across the smooth glass table. It slid with a quiet, menacing scrape, coming to a dead stop right against his coffee saucer. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I simply looked at the people who had tortured my grandfather and began to dismantle their lives piece by piece. Open it! Thomas, I commanded, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the conference room. It is a complete line-by-line forensic audit of your entire existence over the last 10 years. I am a senior corporate auditor. You genuinely thought I would just arrange a funeral and walk away without looking at the ledgers. You underestimated me to a fatal degree. Thomas stared at the envelope as if it were a live explosive. Andre, however, snatched it up. He ripped back the metal clasp and pulled out the thick stack of highlighted bank statements, tax records, and corporate filings. I watched Andre's eyes scan the top page. I watched the arrogant day-trading prodigy physically deflate as he realized he was holding a meticulously documented roadmap of his own federal crimes. You see, Andre, I continued, leaning back in my chair. You like to project this image of a financial genius. You stood in that country club ballroom on Saturday and bragged to your investors about your brilliant real estate acquisitions and your massive capital liquidity. But you are not a genius. You are a parasite running a glorified Ponzi scheme. Crestview Capital was entirely broke until 3 months ago. I turned my gaze to my mother, who was sitting completely rigid, her black pearls trembling against her chest. And you too, I said, looking from Susan to Thomas. You played the role of the wealthy suburban elite perfectly. The country club memberships, the luxury cars, the perfectly manicured lawn. But it was all a house of cards. 10 years of severe compounding tax evasion. The Internal Revenue Service was literally weeks away from seizing your home and slapping both of you with federal indictments. You were utterly bankrupt. So you looked at the 82-year-old man living in your guest room, you saw the $3 million check he received from selling his life's work, and you decided to steal it. That is a lie! Susan gasped, her voice shrill and trembling. Henry gave us that money. He wanted to help the family. I did not give you a dime. I shot back, my voice cracking like a whip. He asked you to deposit it into his primary savings account so he could pay for his own end-of-life care. Instead, Thomas intercepted the wire transfer. You took nearly $1 million of your own father's money and secretly wired it directly to the United States Treasury to pay off your back taxes and save yourselves from federal prison. Then you took the remaining $2 million and funneled it directly into Andre's fraudulent shell company, Crestview Capital. I pointed a finger at Andre, who was now sweating profusely his expensive cologne, failing to mask the sharp scent of sheer panic. You used my grandfather's stolen cash to buy that waterfront estate for Madison, I stated, laying out the final undeniable truth. You bought the sports cars in cash. You paid for the $60,000 country club reception with his money. You used his stolen life savings to artificially inflate your corporate value, all so you could trick new investors into funding your failing portfolio. You laundered stolen funds through a dummy LLC, Andre. We are filing a lawsuit, Madison yelled, though her voice lacked its usual venom. She looked terrified. You cannot just take everything from us. Donovan stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, his presence dominating the entire room. He looked down at my family with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. She does not need to sue you, Madison, Donovan said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. The state has already done it for her. Donovan reached into his briefcase and produced a stack of legal summons. He tossed them onto the table. They slid across the glass, stopping directly in front of Thomas, Susan, Andre, and Madison. You have all just been formally served with a civil action for elder financial exploitation and aggravated fraud, Donovan announced. Abigail brought me the forensic audit over a week ago. We filed the emergency injunctions under seal. Do you remember your credit cards declining at the country club last week? Do you remember the wire transfers for the Aspen compound failing to clear? That was not a banking error, Andre. That was the federal government locking you out of your stolen life. Andre dropped the audit. The heavy packet of papers slapped against the glass table. Every single corporate account tied to Crestview Capital is frozen. Donovan continued, delivering the information with brutal precision. Your personal checking accounts are frozen. The deed to the waterfront estate has a state lien attached to it, meaning you cannot sell it, mortgage it, or borrow against it. You cannot access a single dime of the money you stole, and you cannot access a single dime of the money your investors gave you. Thomas clutched his chest, his breathing turning rapid and shallow. You cannot do this. We will give the money back. We will sell the cars. We will make the estate whole. You cannot make the estate whole, Thomas, Donovan replied, a grim, predatory smile touching the corners of his mouth. Because in this state, the laws protecting vulnerable seniors from financial abuse by family members carry a mandatory penalty of treble damages. That means the court does not just demand the stolen money back. The court triples the penalty to punish the offenders. Donovan leaned over the table, placing his hands flat on the glass, bringing his face inches from my father's. You stole $3 million from an 82-year-old man, Donovan whispered. You now owe his estate $9 million. You are going to be stripped down to the studs. The state is going to liquidate your house, your cars, your wife's jewelry, and every single asset Andre purchased with that stolen money. And when the civil courts are done picking your bones clean, I am personally handing this forensic audit over to the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission. The absolute crushing reality of their situation finally breached the walls of their arrogance. The facade did not just crack, it utterly pulverized into dust. Andre was the first to break. The slick, untouchable financial prodigy vanished, replaced by a terrified, cornered animal. He spun around, his face contorted with vicious rage, and lunged toward my father. He grabbed Thomas by the lapels of his custom suit, practically dragging him out of his chair. You told me it was clean, Andre screamed, spit flying from his mouth as he shook my father violently. You swore to me the IRS was handled. You swore the seed money was a legitimate gift. You set me up. I have 75 angry investors, expecting a quarterly return on Monday, and my entire firm is locked down. They are going to indict me for embezzlement, you stupid, arrogant old man. Get your hands off him, Susan shrieked, jumping up and trying to pry Andre's fingers off my father's jacket. You ruined me, Andre roared, shoving Susan backward. She stumbled against the glass wall of the conference room, her black pearls snapping and clattering sharply against the hardwood floor. Madison watched her husband attack her parents, her eyes wide with total uncomprehending horror. She looked down at the designer dress she was wearing, down at the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, suddenly realizing that none of it belonged to her. The state was coming to take her waterfront home. The state was coming to take her luxury SUV. She had absolutely no marketable skills, no career, and zero independent wealth. She collapsed into her plush leather chair, buried her face in her hands, and began to sob hysterically. It was a loud, ugly, gasping wail of pure self-pity. Thomas shoved Andre away, straightening his ruined suit jacket. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting wildly around the room as he searched for an exit, a loophole, a way to spin the narrative. But there was no audience left to manipulate. There were no country club investors to charm. There was only the cold hard glass of the conference room and the absolute ruin of his own making. Susan crawled on her hands and knees across the polished floor, ignoring the scattered pearls. She grabbed the fabric of my trousers, her perfectly manicured fingers digging into my leg. The aristocratic, condescending matriarch was gone. She was just a terrified, pathetic woman staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. "Abigail, please," Susan begged, her voice cracking, mascara running down her cheeks in dark, jagged lines. "Please, you have to drop the lawsuit. You have to call off the freeze. We are your family. If you hand that audit to the IRS, they will put us in federal prison. We will lose the house. We will have nowhere to go. Please, I am your mother. You cannot do this to us." I looked down at the woman gripping my leg. I felt absolutely nothing. The well of my empathy had run completely dry the night they threw a dying 82-year-old man out into a Colorado blizzard because he coughed too loudly during a dinner party. I gently but firmly pried her fingers off my trousers and stepped back. "You told me to deal with him," I said, my voice cutting through the chaotic screaming and sobbing of the room. I looked directly into my father's panicked eyes, echoing the cruel, dismissive text message he had sent me months ago. "I did. I took him in. I cared for him. I audited his life. And now the state is going to deal with you." I turned my back on them. I picked up my leather folio, walked to the frosted glass doors, and pushed them open. I did not look back as I walked down the quiet, carpeted hallway of the law firm. Behind me, the muffled sounds of Andre's screaming threats and my mother wailing echoed through the heavy doors. They were tearing each other apart, turning on one another the exact second the stolen money vanished. I stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and felt the immense, suffocating weight of the past decade finally lift from my shoulders. 1 year later, the harsh, biting wind of Cheyenne was a distant memory. I sat behind a sleek, solid oak desk in a brightly lit modern office overlooking the Denver skyline. The plaque on the frosted glass door outside read, "The Henry Foundation for Elder Advocacy and Protection." The Deep Core Geological Survey had been entirely accurate. The 50 acres of Wyoming ranch land I inherited sat directly over a massive lithium vein. We leased the extraction rights to a global energy conglomerate for a staggering sum. I did not buy a waterfront mansion. I did not buy a fleet of sports cars. I used the initial 8-figure royalty payout to establish a fully funded nonprofit legal and financial strike team. We provided free, aggressive forensic auditing and top-tier legal representation for elderly individuals who were being financially exploited by their own families. Donovan sat on my board of directors, helping us legally dismantle predators across 3 different states. My biological family had completely disintegrated. The civil courts had moved with brutal, unforgiving speed. Thomas and Susan lost the suburban estate, their vehicles, and their country club memberships to satisfy the treble damages owed to Henry's trust. They were currently living in a cramped 1-bedroom apartment in a rundown industrial district, drowning under the weight of the ongoing federal tax evasion indictments my audit had triggered. Andre's fraudulent empire collapsed spectacularly. When his wealthy investors realized the offshore accounts were empty and the Wyoming land inheritance was a complete lie, they turned on him. He was currently sitting in a county jail awaiting trial on 22 counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and operating an unlicensed securities firm. Madison had immediately filed for divorce the second the state seized the waterfront house. With no degree, no assets, and her reputation entirely toxic in high society circles, she was forced to move into a cheap rental unit. Last I heard, she was working 40 hours a week, scanning barcodes at a discount retail outlet, spending her breaks aggressively avoiding eye contact with the women she used to mock at the country club. I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair and looked at the polished oak surface. Right beside my computer monitor sat a simple silver-framed photograph. It was a picture of my grandfather Henry, taken years ago on the Wyoming ranch. He was wearing his battered Stetson hat, a faded denim jacket, and a warm, genuine smile. The vintage gold Rolex peeked out from under his frayed cuff. I touched the edge of the silver frame, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of peace. The predators had been stripped of their armor. The stolen legacy had been reclaimed and forged into a weapon for good. I smiled back at the photograph, listening to the quiet, sweet sound of absolute justice ticking forward.